What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of The Strange Road. I'm Mikey. This is Bub. Bub, how we doing today?
Excellent.
Awesome.
Yourself?
You excited?
Yes.
I'm excited. This is good. This is a long time coming, guys. We have
Trying to hold
our
it in.
buddy Jeffery Wilson in studio. That's right. Jeffery Wilson from Friends of the Serpent Mound is here with us.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a long time coming, Jeff. We've been wanting to get you in here for a while. I met Jeff. I kind of just jumped up and introduced myself to you, and I think it was like 2016 or 15 at one of Tom and Terry's Serpent Mound Star Knowledge events.
Can you not to gloss over that? Can you tell it, because you just told me this story the other day?
Yeah.
Of meeting Jeff, and it was really cool.
He probably doesn't remember it
because I think it was one of those moments that, like, in the moment, Mike was like, I probably shouldn't do this, and then he was like, you know what? No, I'm gonna do this. And I think
I didn't want to seem like a creeper kind of guy. It's just like, nope, I need to introduce at least, hi, I'm here. I'm interested in these kind of things. Video production guy from Columbus, I think, is how I introduced myself. But Roa was with me.
Carlos,
our buddy that has done the mural that you see in the studio, our logo. He's kind of our artist. And we saw one of your presentations, and then I introduced myself to Ross Hamilton and Jeff. Jeffrey currently serves as president of the Friends of the Serpent Mound, which is a 501c3 organization. And they do basically advocating for Serpent Mound, and they do a lot of work around Ohio with other earthworks, and have contributed to preservation of many sites in Ohio, and are doing great things. Jeff's been a guest on various national TV broadcasts, and as well as local radio programs, national programs like Coast A.M. with George Noory, and most recently, you were on Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse. We'll get into some of that. There's a lot of controversy happening around that show and Graham, and there's just some things that I think there's a lot of perspectives and things happening online right now, which is fascinating for us to just kind of get behind the scenes and see what's really going on. And that's really what we're trying to do is understand the situation that's kind of unfolding on the internet. And it's been over a month now since it's been out, and it hasn't really calmed down too much. But before we get into all that, Jeff, I'm going to give you the floor. First of all, where can we find you, your work, and tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved with this stuff, and Friends of the Serpent Mound.
Well, you can find Friends of Serpent Mound at friendsofserpentmound.org.
Okay.
And I am, as you said, I serve as the president of the organization currently. I've been the president for a while. I keep getting reelected. The Friends of Serpent Mound got started in 2004. At the time, the Ohio Historical Society, as they were then known, now today they're known as the Ohio History Connection, they were going through a bit of a financial crisis. The state legislature in Ohio decided to cut their budget allocation by 50%.
Okay.
And then the subsequent budget cycle, they cut it another 50%. And I think over the course of 3 budget cycles, they got their budget cut by about 90% overall.
Wow.
And they're not a state agency. They're a private corporation. But they do a bunch of contract work for the state, like they maintain all the state records, whatever state agencies, they maintain all those records. And they get paid by the state to do that. The state owns different parks and properties, and they get contracted out to manage that kind of stuff. And so because of the financial crisis, they laid off something like 90% of their employees.
Okay.
And Serpent Mound was down to 2 employees. A site manager who was charged with managing 7 parks, and a guy cut the grass. And
That's it.
That's it. Conditions at the park dramatically declined.
I would imagine.
And
Yeah.
It's a big
people
property.
in Adams County took notice of that. And so the local Travel and Visitors Bureau and the Chamber of Commerce set up a committee to try to figure out what could they do to help.
Right.
And that committee became the Friends of Serpent Mound.
Oh, cool.
People that were on that committee organized it and developed that organization to help them manage the park.
Okay.
So the volunteers in that organization, staffed the museum and, spruced up the grounds, planted flowers, and, gave tours. And at the time, the Ohio Historical Society was selling access before and after hours to the park. And they needed people to supervise that. And so the Friends of Serpent Mound supervised. They would just,
It's like private tours, or
it wasn't
events?
tours. It was, you could essentially rent out the park for whatever your private thing was.
Have a wedding out there?
Oh yeah, they had weddings and they did all kinds of stuff.
That's wild.
And so we kind of were charged as volunteers to sort of make sure, chaperone, make sure they're not doing anything crazy and all that kind of stuff. So, we did that for a while, and that's really how the organization began.
Okay.
And over the time, we got involved with various efforts to help preserve other ancient earthworks in the site. The first one that I worked on was to help save Spruce Hill.
Okay.
That is a hilltop earthwork built about 2,000 years ago that went up for auction. And so I got on.
Went up for auction.
Yep, it was privately owned and went up for auction. And a consortium of people got together to try to help preserve that. And now that is preserved as part of the Arc of the Appalachians system. And we managed to, raise enough money to save that site. In 2012, I was doing an aerial photo flight, taking pictures of various things, and I took a photograph of an earthwork called the Junction Group. Most people had assumed that it had been destroyed, but I had seen that from the airplane. You could tell the shape of the earthwork. It's a kind of a group of a whole bunch of geometric earthworks and circular enclosures and stuff. And I took literally the only photograph that had ever been taken of it, that
crazy.
Showed that it was still around, and it went up for auction. And so the Friends of Serpent Mound was the first group to start raising money to preserve it. And I think there was a consortium of about 40-some different groups that got involved to help preserve that site. And that is now also a part of the Arc of the Appalachians preserve system.
Very cool. Very cool.
I got involved in trying to raise money to preserve the Butler County hilltop earthwork in Butler County, Ohio. Again, another hilltop earthwork enclosure. It had been in private hands. The person that owned it had been in their family for generations. He died. No heirs, or the heirs wanted to sell it, and so I think we had about 2 weeks to raise enough money. Friends of Serpent Mound was the first one to start raising money to preserve that. The consortium of groups that got together, which included, things like the Archaeological Conservancy, a whole bunch, failed miserably in the effort to try to raise enough money. I think, in only 2 weeks, I think we only raised about $150,000. Purchase price was close to $2 million, and there was a local foundation that stepped in, the Pyramid Hill Sculpture Group. That foundation that runs that park, which is about 1.5 miles to the east of where this earthwork was located, they stepped in and provided the purchase price. And so they own and they preserve it.
That's great. I was just going to say, so when these go up for auction, I could go bid on this?
Yeah.
I could buy this mound earthwork.
You could, yeah.
A lot of earthwork sites are private.
Yes.
I'm just thinking of it from the aspect of, again, having read a lot about mounds being dug up, like somebody buying it today to be like, I'm going to dig that thing up.
Yeah, it could happen.
Find out what goes
Could
on.
absolutely
And
happen.
People are a little more conscious now,
Right.
versus like the 1800s.
So,
just a wild
you know,
thought.
we've been involved in a lot of kinds of things like that, advocacy for the preservation of different mounds and earthwork sites. And, you know, we've kind of branched out a little bit beyond just Serpent Mound itself. But
That's great. That's so cool.
So, you know, as a volunteer there, you know, we did a whole series of, you know, various activities to try to help bring awareness to Serpent Mound, help people understand what it is. And I've done, you know, almost 20 years worth of research now into try to understand Serpent Mound from all kinds of various aspects.
Right.
My background was in science. I got my master's degree in general science from Eastern Michigan University.
Okay.
I used to volunteer to run the observatory there, Sherzer Observatory. And I did a lot of observational astronomy. I did radio astronomy. In my master's thesis was on a project that I got a NASA grant for. I literally mapped data on the surface of the moon from the Lunar Prospector mission. So that work, had a background in remote sensing. I did a lot of graduate work on remote sensing, satellite stuff, and aerial photo interpretation, things like that.
Wow.
And so I applied both my astronomical skills and my remote sensing skills, and that allowed me to, you know, help understand Serpent Mound from a perspective that most of the archaeologists were not really looking at. And, you know, some of that material I guess we'll see today, and we can talk about some of that.
So before you got into the Friends of the Serpent Mound, et cetera, and Serpent Mound's going into decay after the budget cuts.
Yeah.
How did you end up near it to begin with? That was just, you're from Michigan originally, correct?
I am,
Okay.
yeah. I moved down in the summer of 2004. I had met my wife, and this is before we got married, and I
Okay.
took a job. I had a job opportunity. I took a job in Cincinnati and moved down to be closer to her, and got involved with volunteering there.
And just naturally was like, wow, that developed over
Well,
time.
it's-
And just
got
kind of,
It's a longer story than that. I'm sure
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
but we'll leave it at that for this.
I guess what
episode.
I was getting at is it just feels kind of meant to be your skill set.
Well, when I was in college, one particular spring break, my vice president of the astronomy club, I was the president of the astronomy club. My vice president was from Loveland, Ohio,
Okay.
and
This is good.
we decided for spring break. I had read an article, I think, in Astronomy Magazine, or maybe it was Sky and Telescope, about Cahokia and prehistoric astronomy here in the
Okay.
United States. And so we decided to, for spring break, go to Cahokia.
Nice.
And
Wow.
we had an extra day. We drove down from Michigan, stayed at his parents' place in Loveland for a day or so. And he had something else that he needed to do. And he's like, do whatever you want to do for the day. And he said to me, there's supposed to be this place kind of out east of here. It's called Serpent Mound. It has something to do with astronomy, but I don't really know anything about it. And I said, oh, okay. So this is long.
amazing.
This is days before the internet.
Yeah.
Right.
No maps and stuff. So you had to get out the paper,
Right.
transportation map, and looked on the map and said, oh, what's this? Miamisburg Mound, Enon Mound. Oh, there's Serpent Mound. So I mapped out this tour. And so on that day, I visited Miamisburg Mound, which is the largest mound in the state of Ohio, about 70 feet tall, and then went to the Enon Mound, which isn't too far away on the north side of Dayton.
Yep.
Then went to Fort Ancient,
Okay.
then went to Serpent Mound, then went to Fort Hill, then went to Sipe Mound,
Wow.
then Mound City,
Wow.
and then finished up at the Tarleton Cross Mound.
So at the end of that, your mind's just,
Yeah, because I'd never
Whoa.
seen anything like any of that.
and it's all right. I mean, it's
All in one day.
And I did that tour in one day.
That's wild.
And then we drove to Cahokia.
wow.
And
Wow.
then it was like, wow, this is unbelievable.
Cahokia is impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
See the
unbelievably
Arch of
impressive.
St. Louis out from it.
Yep.
On top of it.
Yeah, and
That's wild.
we were kind of interested in it because of the Woodhenge there,
Okay.
Yeah.
and we can talk
Did they
about
have it
Woodhenges later.
recreated
Yes.
when you were there back then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Kyle and I were just there over
I can tell you a
summer.
funny story about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That Woodhenge was discovered in the 1970s. I think it was Warren Witry was the archaeologist, I think, that kind of was the first one to kind of write about it.
Okay.
And at some point they decided that they were going to rebuild it, like recreate it from the original post holes of what they had found. And so they got a telephone pole. I think was the first one that they used, was to erect a telephone pole in the original hole to recreate the beginning of it.
Gotcha.
And they had a group of volunteers that got together and they put that pole up, packed it in or whatever, and within 10 minutes it got hit by lightning.
Wow.
might be a sign.
Well, it happened again. They found that there was a post hole on Monk's Mound on that first tier up of the big, huge pyramid at Kokia.
Yeah.
And they decided to put a pole there to reconstruct the original, pole where they found the post hole, which is kind of like the center point of the whole city. It falls along those alignments. And they put it up. It got hit by lightning so many times they had to take it down because they were afraid it was going to kill some, tourists.
Jeez.
Wow.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
That's
and
wild.
What year was that when you went on that big tour?
I think it was 96 or 97.
Okay.
And then I actually took a second trip down and visited Serpent Mound a second time around 98. So I'd been there a couple of times.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
my interest was originally in the archaeoastronomy aspect of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Wow. So you've been, and then what year did you move down?
2004.
2004. So
Yep.
you've been there for a while. You've been there. Living next door to Serpent Mound, what is that like?
Yeah.
'Cause your property is incredible.
Yeah, it is amazing. Obviously, we live inside the meteor crater.
Yes.
Serpent Mound is
crazy.
inside of a meteor crater. For those that aren't aware, it has a federal designation. Serpent Mound is designated as a National Historic Landmark, but the crater is designated as a natural landmark. So it's called the Serpent Mound Crypto-Explosive Area Natural National Landmark. And there is a marker for it. It's at Woodland Altars, if anybody wants to know, which is on the other side of the crater from where Serpent Mound is. The crater is about 5 miles in diameter, and Woodland Altars is kind of on the northeast side of the crater, and that's where that marker ended up. I have no idea. It was designated in 1980.
Okay.
And Serpent Mound is kind of on the southwest side of the crater. And so I live in the crater. Our property borders Serpent Mound. So
I have to say,
a little inside scoop.
What's that?
We have a video coming out. We made a DVD with Tom Johnson.
Oh yeah.
Tom and Terry from House of Fake Ops, and Tom brought us on a tour. We filmed the whole thing. Jeff actually has some imagery and some credits in the video, but that's coming out real soon. And shout out to Tom and Terry.
Yeah.
But it's Tom goes through the
he's one of the best experts on the crater.
Absolutely.
I was about to say,
Blown away by
here my
his
whole
knowledge
life.
about that impact
never
crater.
knew there was an impact crater in Ohio. And I would say, unless you live around there, a fair majority of people have no idea.
Yeah, there's no signage. Like when you're driving into it or driving through it. Friends of Serpent Mound actually engaged with the Ohio Department of Transportation and was beginning to develop that signage, and then they sort of stopped. But it's kind of been kicking around in the back of our minds that maybe we should try again and put up some signage so that when you descend into the crater, you're entering the Serpent Mound Crypto Explosive Area, you're leaving the crater, that kind of thing. Because most people don't know. It's hard to see. It's so big that you can't really just go to one place to view it.
Right.
And you can see it from an area. I think we have a slide where I show, I did a LiDAR map of the crater, and we can show that later.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I've
absolutely.
been to the crater impact out southwest. Right.
The one in Arizona.
It's like a mile across.
Right. It's much smaller. So this is bigger.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. It's so funny to think, wow, obvious it's here.
Yeah.
It's even bigger. It's it's less obvious.
It's a lot of electromagnetic anomalies. There's weather patterns that are that kind of are different inside the crater versus outside the crater, which is broke my brain.
There have been far more scientific studies done by geologists of the crater in terms of, like what you said, they did electromagnetic field measurements, gravitational changes, measuring that stuff, looking at, they did coring to figure out that it was a meteor crater because nobody knew what it was. There have been more studies by geologists done of the crater than archaeologists have done of Serpent Mound, for sure.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh, by far.
You would not expect that.
Yeah, there's been very, very few archaeological studies done.
But
of Serpent Mound.
way more people know about Serpent Mound than they do the impact crater.
That's right. Yeah,
by far.
You're talking about two different groups of people that are interested, though.
That's right.
As far as the public being interested in one site and the scientific community and historical aspect looking at it.
And how long?
Yeah, I've tried to sort of help that along. I've given many public presentations specifically about the crater. I think much of the material probably that Tom Johnson covered was stuff that was in my original presentation, but he's been doing it for a while.
Yeah,
he's pretty well versed in it all.
Yeah. It was fun. That day of shooting was so much fun with Tom. We just took us on a magical mystery tour of all around the Serpent, and a lot of those places I had never been to. The graveyard where you can see the upheaval. So yeah, I mean, and also, guys, Jeff is going to be speaking at Tom and Terry's event, the Serpent Mound Star Knowledge event tomorrow, correct?
Yeah.
And what presentation are you going to be giving there? And it's 11 a.m., right?
11 in the morning.
Okay,
yes.
11 in the morning.
I'm stepping in to fill in for Ross Hamilton. Ross Hamilton was scheduled and he now couldn't make it. So I stepped in to fill in his spot. So it's an hour long. And it is a presentation I've given in the past, but this is specifically about the winter solstice and Serpent Mound.
Okay.
So Serpent Mound has a number of astronomical alignments built into its design, where it points to the horizon where the sun comes up on the winter solstice and where the sun sets. And so I'm going to talk about that. I think we have maybe a slide in here that will show a little bit of that. I guess a preview or whatever. But yeah, I decided I would step in and help them out. And, do that.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
Ross is a great guy. We went to his house and interviewed him on the winter solstice in 2020, which is where this video with Tom that we put together for that little live stream event. That was when COVID was happening, so we had this little winter solstice virtual event that Strange Road and Terry and Tom and all of us kind of banded together. Went down to Ross's, got to interview him. It was a fun day. So keep an eye out on that. Tomorrow, winter solstice event with Serpent Mound Star Knowledge, 11 a.m., guys. So we got to know Jeff a little bit. Jeff's got here about noon today, so we've been kind of kicking it, hanging out. We've had some unexpected phone calls here in the studio by none other than Graham Hancock, which was interesting. Kind of getting some a little bit of trying to just understand the Ancient Apocalypse show on Netflix, and I guess you could call it drama that's surrounding the show as a whole. And then kind of a microcosm is some of the things that are happening that Graham spoke about. It's out there in the public with interactions that he had during the filming of episode 7 on Ancient Apocalypse.
6, I think.
Episode 6.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was the one where they went to Serpent Mound and then the place in Louisiana.
Poverty Point.
Poverty Point. Mm-hmm. Yes, that was a really, really cool episode. And honestly, as video guys, really well put together series.
Yep.
It looks really sharp. The information's really fascinating. But Graham's been kind of for the last month or so getting some heat. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of different angles.
You mean they're launching nuclear weapons?
Yeah, getting a little bit of heat.
It's insane. Just totally ridiculous what Graham is going through. Look, first of all, I met Graham a couple years prior to this show being put together. He came out to Serpent Mound. He was doing research for his book America Before.
Okay.
Yeah, we got a little
And-
shot with Ross and Graham
Yep.
from that day.
And that picture also shows his wife Santha. Santha is an indigenous black woman from Sri Lanka. And the reason I chose this photo in particular is because it shows Santha. And for the last month or two, and probably before this, Graham has been taking heat from the archaeological community, calling him a racist.
Which is odd.
He has mixed race children, and it's totally insane what people are saying about him. They don't know him at all. He's generally such a gentleman and the most decent person, but what they really are going after is they don't like what his message is. They don't like
Sure.
what he's saying.
Sure.
And so they're, instead of criticizing his information, which it's tough to challenge, they're going after him and trying to tear him down
Sure.
as an individual.
Sure. So
And
don't
that's
debate
completely-
the actual information,
Yeah, it's
subject, and
it's
presentation.
completely
It's a way to
outrageous.
remove the debate
Right.
from the situation.
Yeah,
Well,
if you just
change the
I mean,
angle.
they're calling him a white supremacist. They're calling him a racist. They're calling him every name in the book. It's
Doesn't strike me as any of that
no, he's not.
at all.
He's totally not anything
Right.
like that.
Yeah,
Which
we've
is,
been following
again,
him.
you can see it in the episodes.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
He
so-
seems like he's a pretty easygoing guy.
yeah,
Passionate, but easygoing.
that's right. And so that kind of criticism is just way out of bounds, and it's so outrageous. And in any event, that trip that he came, he came to, and we helped to facilitate some of his research. Helped him to get the photograph that Santha took of the astronomical alignment of the sun setting on the summer solstice,
Oh, very
which
cool.
made it into America Before. And I contributed a number of my LiDAR images of Serpent Mound that I had done
Oh, cool.
that made it into America Before. Okay,
cool.
so, but one of the discussions that Graham and I had when he came for that book was that the archaeological site of Serpent Mound is much, much older than the archaeologists have been telling the public. He made a point in Ancient Apocalypse, for instance. He showed the photograph of the historical marker signage that is at Serpent Mound. And when you read that, they give a specific historical narrative about Serpent Mound, saying that it was built by the Fort Ancient culture around 1100 AD, and all of the information on there is totally erroneous. It's completely out of date, and they haven't, changed it at all. And so, that brings up the question. It's been kind of a debate in the country over the last, few years, 5-6 years, about, with people wanting to remove statues of Confederate soldiers or whatever, and,
Right.
saying, the question is, well, do you get your history from these monuments, or do you get your history from some other source? Because if you just go and get your history off that sign, you're going to believe the narrative that they've got on the sign.
That's a great point.
But the sign is totally wrong. And, so that was generally his point is, hey, when you go to the site, don't read the signage because the signage is messed up. And, they need to update it for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that, came about as a result of that was he put out his book, America Before, which was, highly criticized by the archaeological community, in the United States.
Okay.
And he's been getting criticism for, a couple decades since he, has been writing in their turf, in their domain, right?
As a journalist,
Yeah,
not as
as a journalist.
claiming to be a scientist.
Yeah, he's not claiming that.
He was a war correspondent, reporter is kind of how he's.
Yeah,
from what I understand,
he
started
does
his
investigative
career.
journalism on a bunch of different subjects, and he really focuses on things that don't get a lot of light shed on them, and he has taken bits and pieces of things
the Sphinx
and created a larger picture about
Yeah.
what was going on
Yeah.
in prehistory. And I don't think that his general overall hypothesis is that unreasonable. In fact,
Right.
many of the things that he has called out have turned out to be true. For instance, he has highlighted the absolute worldwide catastrophe that happened during the Younger Dryas.
Right.
And that's undeniable scientific information that other scientists pieced together. And that was controversial
from
for
other
many
fields,
years.
geologists.
That
and-
was very controversial.
All he's
for-
doing is
right?
taking disparate information and
Right.
drawing the connections.
Drawing the connections.
That
And-
other groups maybe don't overlap and they don't see them, but
Right.
he sees the bigger
Yeah,
picture.
And
everybody
it's-
has
and
their
his-
specialty, so
and his
Right.
and his idea that, well,
He's solving puzzles.
we know that people lived through the Ice Age,
Right.
and we know that people lived through the Younger Dryas because we're here today.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so is it that unreasonable to believe that the same people with the same IQ bandwidth as you and me today were living back then? We're all the same human beings, right?
Right.
That there possibly could have been people that developed a civilization before the worldwide catastrophe of the Younger Dryas.
Right.
It doesn't seem that
Right.
unreasonable. And if you look at things like just in Europe, for instance, there was, the Magdalenian Revolution, they call it, which was, somewhere between like 14,000 years ago and 22,000 years ago. That's when people started doing a lot of the cave paintings and developing all kinds of different kinds of technology and so on and so forth of, stone, bone, you name
Right.
it. So there were people that were developing art, culture, music, you find bone whistles from that period of time. So why is it so unreasonable that happened before the Younger Dryas catastrophe? We already know that happened in Europe. So why is that so controversial? It's not controversial, but because Graham says it, it's controversial. It's just ridiculous. So I'm not aligned with Graham on every single thing under the sun. And
Right.
if we want to talk about some differences in details that they presented in Ancient Apocalypse about Serpent Mound that I disagree with,
Sure.
we could talk about that stuff. But the idea is, he put forward a hypothesis. In science, you be prepared to defend your hypothesis, but other people can criticize your hypothesis based on the merits of the data.
But that's not what's going on.
That's not what's happening.
And that's
he's a racist. He's a white supremacist. It's totally crazy.
well, and I think it's interesting too that, like you just said, you have some points that you obviously line up with him on where you think very closely, and probably others where you couldn't be more divergent, right? Like you just nope, we're just gonna have to agree to disagree on
Which
that.
is
But
what we're supposed to do, by
that's-
the way. We're
that's
supposed to
conversational
have
discourse,
debate.
Right.
And if there's someone else has better information or more data, you add to the story. Because of this doesn't take away the work that's been done at all. I mean,
there's not allowed
it's
to be
just
adding to the story, is
it.
what it seems like, right?
So-
But it's just set in stone, and then there's nothing else that can come in. Well, I mean, what about Einstein and Newton? Like Newton's work just doesn't go away.
So eventually, there was a production company that came to Graham and developed a series, and they sold it to Netflix, and they wanted to do one of the episodes, at least part of one of the episodes at Serpent Mound. So they went all around the world. You guys see the show? They went to Indonesia, and they went to Turkey, and they went to Malta, and they went to Mexico. Look at the pyramids. Everywhere they went around the world, they had to get governmental approval to permits to film at all these places, and they got that approval in every place, including World Heritage Site of Poverty Point in Louisiana.
Yeah, they had a big interview
The
right
only
there.
place in the entire world that refused to give him a permit to film was Serpent Mound, and the Ohio History Connection refused to grant him a permit. And
that's wild.
And he came to me and was like, "What can I do?" And I said, "Well,
Now
really
that's what's
wild.
being contested right now is
right,
whether or not Ohio. And we don't have to go there just yet. We do
Right.
have a awesome BTS photo of Jeff's day with Graham.
yeah." So Santha Hancock took this photo of us and
It's a
sent
great
this to
photo.
me. So we're standing literally on on our adjacent property looking towards the Serpent Mound Park. And from this angle, you can't really see it, but from the angle where they filmed, behind us is the large conical mound by the parking lot at Serpent Mound. So that's why we filmed in that location, because he was not allowed to film on the property. So
was he allowed on the property? Did he get to walk around the structure itself? Not when they were filming, but did he actually get to go in and see Serpent Mound? And
he did for his research for America Before.
I'm saying for this last trip?
For this, he did not have time.
Okay.
They had a filming, things. And so...
I was just wondered if they went that far with it. Like, you're not even allowed. Like,
no,
we're not even going to film.
They just did not grant him permission to film.
Okay.
And so they now, what has happened in the last few days is that there was another video podcast group out there that they went to Serpent Mound after watching Ancient Apocalypse, saw Graham read that email that he had gotten from the Ohio History Connection.
Right.
And they drove to Serpent Mound and then interviewed the employee in the gatehouse when you pay your money when you come in.
We have that video if we want to play it back.
I wouldn't.
Yeah, okay.
I wouldn't give him any more attention than it is.
Yeah,
but what
totally.
they did was they interviewed the person from the OHC, and they told them an invented story that, no, we didn't ban them from coming here, but that what they had requested was that they wanted to come and shut down the park for 4 days during the summer solstice to film.
Right.
That's totally not the case, because they filmed during the fall equinox. The production was not for the summer solstice at all.
I was going to say, I remember this summer you said that they were there in the fall.
Yes, they were there.
That's what was confusing.
They were there
me.
around the fall equinox. They had nothing to do with the summer solstice at all. So the video, that lady telling that story, is totally fabricated. The second
it's probably
thing was,
not. She's being fed information. She's just,
exactly.
She's a person that works there. Let's be really clear. She's not in charge of the park. The manager.
No.
So
she's being coached what to say.
Sure.
And we got reports from another person. We had a person that we gave a tour to, and they reached out to us after the fact. After the tour was done, they went in the museum, talked to the manager about this same subject of why'd you ban Graham Hancock from filming, and she said, we didn't. The letter that Graham read on the show was fabricated. That was also told to somebody. And so I reached out to Graham. I said, hey, this is what people are saying. And so he has posted this online. You can go out to Graham's webpage, grahamhancock.com, and you can see the actual email that he received. And it clearly states at the bottom of it that we are not going to allow you to film specifically because of Graham Hancock.
And that's basically the last two sentences there at the bottom.
Yeah.
If you guys really want to read that, it's grahamhancock.com.
Right.
So you have basically.
So they're denying and they're lying about what actually transpired. But Graham's got the evidence to show that that's exactly what took place. Was they denied it because it was Graham Hancock. And so, that brings up questions about censorship. It brings up questions about control of the site. Like, why do this? What is the point? The thing is that Graham isn't the first one to be denied filming permitting at Serpent Mound.
Just maybe the most visible.
The Friends of Serpent Mound also facilitated in exactly the same way that we helped facilitate Graham's, episode. There was a Native American production company that wanted to do an episode for Red Earth Uncovered, which is a Canadian program. The entire production team is made up of First Nations peoples. They, the writers, the director, the producer, the cameraman, the sound guys, the interviewers, they're all First Nation peoples.
Okay.
And they wanted to do an episode about Serpent Mound. The whole show of Red Earth Uncovered is about Native peoples trying to go and find out information about their own oral traditions. So they have a tradition about Serpent Mound, the Great Horned Serpent, so they wanted to film an episode there. They were denied by the OHC to film there.
This is wild.
Because they had done a prior episode about Native American oral traditions of Sasquatch, and they said, well, that's paranormal. we don't want anything associated with paranormal about Serpent Mound, so denied. So we facilitated exactly the same way. They filmed on the adjacent property, same location that Graham was staying in. We did a shoot from there. I did an interview with them. I gave them the same kind of drone imagery, different drone imagery than what I gave, for Graham's show. So, you can kind of work around it, but yeah, it's kind of insane. I mean, they've denied NPR, they denied, some of the major network affiliates, out of Cincinnati to try to film there. We've had to host them on the adjacent property because it's all about them trying to control the narrative about what Serpent Mound is and what it's, and they don't want anything that deviates from their narrow story.
They're in their words, they're trying to protect it, and according to this email is we want to protect the heritage and essentially the narrative of what we know to be fact,
the story that they wrote themselves,
the Native American history of the tribe that's involved with.
Well, if you
Ohio
read that letter carefully, they talk about how they view their role. We're talking about the Ohio History Connection, how they view their role in regards to Serpent Mound, and they do say in there that their role is to preserve the historical narrative, right? And, well, what is that historical narrative? Well, it's the narrative that they wrote themselves, right? So anything that deviates from the narrative that they wrote themselves, they don't want that an alternative, viewpoint or a story or anything like that. And so, again, it goes to...
Did they get burnt in the past, or did anything happen to where...
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
some reason why they're very protective of that?
In the last 5 years, or 6 or 7 years, the things have really, got really tightened down with screws on this because of what happened with Ancient Aliens.
Okay.
Ancient Aliens wanted to do an episode about Serpent Mound. They reached out, got permission to film at Serpent Mound.
Okay.
In fact, Dr. Brad Lepper, architect from the Ohio History Connection, was in the episode. He got filmed for the episode. I personally declined to be a part of the episode. I'm not an adherent to that idea of Ancient Aliens, and so I declined to be part of it. But they filmed that episode, and the OHC got so much, flack from the academic community about it that they just basically shut down all productions, so there isn't really anything that people can, do to, it doesn't matter if you're Native American, I guess, or, Graham Hancock, nobody gets to, do anything there, so.
When we shot our interview with you in 2018, the guy that was in charge of the park, the ranger, older gentleman, great guy, used to get along with him super well, and he left and was like, hey, guys, feel free to fly the drone. You guys want to shoot your interview? Cool, I'm going home. And we just had the park. We just were like, really?
That's great.
And Tim
Goodwin.
Tim Goodwin was great.
Tim Goodwin.
We shot the interview with you, which is up on our YouTube page.
Tim Goodwin's a great guy. And, over time, you have to build trust with people. And
yeah, Tim had seen us around too, so
we had a relationship that we aren't going to screw up the park. We love the park.
Right.
We want to protect the park.
We have been preserving it from the beginning.
We've been volunteering it for a long time. So we don't want to have anything crazy or nothing like that happen to it. So
so leaving you there actually just extends his watch.
Right, exactly.
By proxy.
The locals have more invested in that place.
Yeah.
There's so many of these cool groups that have been doing events and bringing, other people to be able to share the Serpent Mound.
Yeah,
and it's just a head scratcher to me why you wouldn't want to work with organizations like yourself and work together.
I mentioned that Graham has been censored there, and Red Earth Uncovered's been censored. Well, Friends of Serpent Mound got censored there too. We used to host and we still host a summer solstice celebration for the
it's a good
weekend
time.
Closest to the solstice. Usually falls on the weekend sometimes. So, and we used to host that event at Serpent Mound as when we were volunteers there. We organized all kinds of events. So we would host, Archaeology Day or Geology Day or Reptile Day, or we did events for the solstices and the equinoxes, and because it's inherently built into the design of Serpent Mound.
That's what it is.
You're there to celebrate that, right? So we would hold a celebration. We have all kinds of speakers from, a whole different range of viewpoints come out and talk about things related to, Serpent Mound or whatever. And so one year, the OHC came to us and said, if you're going to do the event at Serpent Mound, you must have all of the speakers' presentations delivered to us 3 months in advance, and we will have a committee go through there and review them for the content. And we said, no, I don't think so. Academic freedom is something that I, kind of stand by. And so
Rightfully
we decided to move the event to the adjacent property, which our family, collectively owns, and we decided to hold the events there, and we kind of affectionately refer to it as the free speech zone, and because they wanted to control and restrict and essentially censor people for what they were saying.
Yeah.
And here's my view about that is, I don't believe that any one person can get the answer.
Right.
Right. So you need a wide range of viewpoints to try to understand, well, some person sees it this way, another person sees it this way, another person sees it this way. Maybe you can take a little bit of this. You might disagree with a lot of it. You might be able to take this a little bit here and come together to figure out what the closer to the truth or what the reality might be.
Right.
But that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is saying, we don't like what this person is saying, they're banned. We don't like what this person is saying, they're banned. We don't like what this person is saying, this is censored. And we don't believe in any of that. So, that's where the friction has come mostly in the last, 10 to 15 years is over issues like that.
The information that's being presented.
Correct.
And here's the thing. I, met Jeff, and extremely measured guy over here.
Right. Very
well researched, scientific, is into instrumentation and scanning and all these different types of show me the facts. He's not some tinfoil wearing hat dude running around
a toolkit.
as if, working for NASA. Your resume is, you're published on academia.edu.
Well, anybody can do that.
That's
not a big deal.
You have some interesting papers with, contributing with Dr. William Romaine, which some of his work has kind of butted heads with Dr. Bradley Lepper, who used to be the head archaeologist.
We could talk about that in a little bit. I would say you've had this picture up here for a while. I can explain what this picture is.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing.
So in the earliest days of the Friends of Serpent Mound, when people were trying to figure out what can we do to help the park, with the financial crisis, we wanted to get people to come to the park throughout the year.
Right.
And
not just,
the winter time is kind of a dark, dead time, right? And so, and this is a fun story. So I came up with this idea to light up the Serpent with luminary candles. And I'm sure you guys remember the band Duran Duran.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Duran Duran had done a documentary in the late 1990s. And in the interview portion of the documentary, they were interviewing the band. The band was talking about how in the earliest days of the band on MTV, their music videos reached millions of people, and it became a double-edged sword for the band. That on one hand, they became incredibly recognizable. But on the other hand, those videos became iconic in the public's mind. The images, when I say the band Duran Duran, a lot of people think, you see the boat, the sailboat with all of them and their silk seats on the boat, sailing, singing Rio or whatever. That's what conjures up in people's minds, is that iconic imagery.
Right.
And they said that forevermore, they have been trying to recreate iconic imagery to give to the public to help them change and break out of that original identifiable iconic imagery.
Okay.
And they talked about the power of iconic imagery. And that really stuck with me. And so I thought, well, what could we do to deliver iconic imagery into the public consciousness about Serpent Mound? And I said, well, white people have been stealing native culture forever, right? Ever since Europeans got to the shore, have been stealing that stuff.
Right.
Why don't we steal a little bit of white culture back and apply it here? There are instances, particularly in some of the southwestern tribes, where they do use luminary candles in, various ceremonies or whatever. Why don't we take something associated around Christmas time that generally, the large Christian population in this country would recognize using luminary candles at Christmas time, but take that and bring it to Serpent Mound and light it up so that when you see it, it just burns that image right into your mind.
It's really wild.
You never can forget
doesn't do it justice.
How often do you still do this?
No. We did this for many years, and then the OHC came to us and
It's one
said,
of the first events I went to.
banned. Can't do this event any longer.
For what reasons?
We were told that a group of Native Americans from Oklahoma didn't like this, and so they banned the event. So they own the site. They're the corporation that owns the site. So you can't really. There's nobody to appeal to or anything like that. They just ended it. So we did it for more than a decade.
Is it because they
thousands of people
their
came out?
ceremonies? They want to be able to have their ceremony.
We
their
weren't given
tribe,
any
or-
explanation other than
I don't think there was a competing agenda. I just think they didn't like.
they didn't
what they were
like the
doing.
people coming out there, I guess. So
So they don't want people to look at this. They don't want people to be out in
Well, it's closed at 5 o'clock. It's an astronomical alignment of the sun, and
At the
the
setting.
sun
It closes at
settings,
5.
and it closes at 5, so you can't even see the sunset, which is
You're not
odd.
allowed to
well,
be there
on the
at
winter
midnight.
solstice you can,
Right, because it's
a little earlier. But
This summer, it's closed for 3 hours by the time it happens.
yeah, so there's all kinds of issues like that about access to the site. It's hard to get people to try to do the right thing. There's a corporation that's got an agenda, and they're trying to placate various groups for political reasons, and we don't have to get into any of that stuff.
Gotcha.
But nevertheless, this was an event that thousands and thousands of people come to. For instance, Midwest Living Magazine did a story on this, named this one of the 3 destinations to go and visit in the Midwest during the Christmas season.
Cool.
So it was inspiring to quite a few people. There is a couple of attendees that walked away from this and said, after this event got shut down, they said, we're going to recreate this. They went and built a replica of Serpent Mound here in Ohio on their farm, and they light it up for the winter solstice now.
Yep,
and we don't
we've
have
heard
anything to
about
do with
that
them.
place.
We never even met them, but it inspired them to do that, and so that's kind of up north
They
of
have a little-
Lima, I think.
I've never
little
heard of
But you
that.
can
party.
you can look
Great.
at they built Serpent Mound perfectly.
Really?
Like when you look at a
Brad
Google
Dents
image.
and Paul Verini have invited us out to that.
Really?
To their event. I've seen pictures. They have it's like by water, I believe. Like
Yeah,
some kind of
they have
pond.
they have a
deck.
large pond.
Yeah, it's the
They
deck's
built
built
they
That's
built
fantastic.
Serpent Mound to
To
one
scale?
1/3 scale.
Okay.
So it's smaller than this one, but it looks identical. You look at it on a Google image,
Super
Google Earth
cool.
image, and it's like, hey,
That's
that's
so
Serpent
cool.
Mound, but it's up by
Shout
Lima,
out to
so-
those folks. Hit us up in
Absolutely
the comments
cool.
if anybody,
Right.
if they want some recognition about the cool scale model of Serpent
Yeah.
Mound. Bravo, that's an undertaking. Good
Yeah.
for you guys.
Well, it's not us. They did
well,
it.
no, those
Yeah.
guys.
Right.
Oh,
Good
absolutely.
for
yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Like taking the initiative,
Yeah.
and
So-
people still get to enjoy lighting of some Serpent Mound.
Yeah.
Right. So,
I'd say that would have been really cool to see.
and I think that photos like this live on, and for more than a decade, it was a fun tradition. Anyway,
Yeah.
So maybe in the future a new regime will come in and recognize the value of it and do
Yeah.
it again. I
Yeah.
don't know, but
And that's awesome. Well, I feel bad for you guys that you're not allowed to do some of these things that you were able to do in the past with Friends of the Serpent Mound and your
Right.
organization.
it is what it is.
do
I
you-
mean, you want to
do you
try to do the right thing,
feel
and
like they're pushing back like they're trying to go head to head with you? Do you feel like they're
well, I think it's more about the control.
Okay.
They want the control, and we're now an independent organization.
You guys don't care about power or
No.
money, or
We don't have
you're
anything
not
to do with
trying to
running the park. We
control-
don't have
right.
anything to do with controlling the park.
You're just
we're
trying to raise
advocating-
awareness.
I want to make this clear.
Yeah, please do.
We advocate for Serpent Mound.
Right.
We don't advocate for the OHC.
Okay.
Okay, and so they are the corporation that owns it.
Right.
And so, they want to have their own control, and they want to have their own control of the narrative and do their own thing. So, it's a difference of, ownership and control. So-
Right.
and we're not looking for that, but
Right.
Right.
so.
Well,
It's a wild situation.
yeah, I think organizations like yours, like you said early on, I mean, if it wasn't for locals, where would this place be? If they didn't have the
Yeah.
money, and you said they had 2 people working there at some time,
Yeah.
you gotta have local communities
I think that's the part
to
of it
protect
that's kind of
these. And we're
slap
gonna get
in the
into
face.
that of how Serpent Mound
Well,
began the protection and the people
it's
that
not. It really wasn't just about Serpent Mound. That happened to all of their historic sites across
Right.
the state, and so all of the sites suffered, not just Serpent Mound. And in fact, it got so bad that the
Yeah.
OHC decided to, and this is a corporate thing, they decided to essentially assign a subcontractor to manage all of their sites across the state. And so they went to local groups that had local stakeholder, sort of interest in maintaining it because they live there, or
Yeah.
they were a volunteer group there, or whatever. And they selected a bunch of these organizations to manage all these sites across the state as a subcontractor management,
Right.
with some oversight, and then they paid them a little pittance on the side to sort of give them some incentive to do it. Certainly not enough money to actually manage any of these sites.
right.
I mean, it's been a complete embarrassing disaster for historical sites in the state. It's but it's a corporate thing, right? It's all
Right.
about the money,
Right.
and it would be, honestly, in my opinion, it would be best if sites like Serpent Mound and many of these sites just got transferred to the Ohio DNR, and then there is some level of representation. You can go to your state representative if you see something out of whack, and your representative can sort of lean on the administration for managing the site better.
Yeah.
They have direct control over funding for those things.
Let's see, that's interesting.
And that would be a better place than where we are today with a private corporation running it all.
Right.
Right. So
Are they a nonprofit or?
they are, but
Yeah.
they have a CEO and a CFO, and they have
Sure.
a board of directors, and the last CEO, according to their last annual statement, was making more money than the governor of Ohio. They're
Wow.
making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and so when they ask for donations and money to help prop up it's really a corporate thing that
Right.
they're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, if you understand that they're a corporation and they make decisions like any other corporation, it's all about the money, it's all about the bottom line. You begin to understand their behavior, and it's becomes very apparent quickly. It's not like, we're a 501c3 corporation technically too,
Yeah,
Friends of
yeah.
Serpent Mound, but we don't have a CEO and a CFO, and we don't have a single paid employee.
Right.
It's all volunteer. We don't have giant budgets or anything like
The
that.
money goes to putting on your events and having.
Yeah.
You guys have little town halls that you
Right.
do.
Nobody's making any money,
Right.
Yeah.
at any of it. But that's a direct contrast to the corporation, right?
Right.
And they, the OHC is a big corporation, and their annual budget's in the millions of dollars, right? So
Okay.
So they're going to have it their way for quite a while, or until something
Yeah.
dramatic happens, or
right.
we'll see how this plays out.
Well,
mean-
there's always changes that happen, right? So 20 years ago they're about ready to financially implode,
Right.
and today it's a little bit different situation. Things can change,
Right.
fortunes reverse,
Right.
control changes. People that get in charge come up with a different mindset. The last
Yeah,
CEO,
yeah.
was very corporate.
Yeah.
Maybe the next CEO, the current, one that just got her job in August, maybe her approach will be different. I don't know.
Sure.
So.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, I mean, it's could change like the seasons,
Right.
There's, I'm sure 100% there are great people that work for these organizations.
Absolutely, yeah.
All across, whether it be the Smithsonian or whoever it is.
Right.
And, there's great people that are doing good work that's within these groups as well. So
Yes, because people are dedicated to trying to preserve, our country's heritage and our country's
yeah,
history.
it's important.
Right.
Right. So, but it's different when that heritage and that control is by a corporation,
Right.
and it's the end goal is financial.
Right.
So that's different than enthusiasts that want to preserve it. So every county has sort of a county historical society, right?
Okay.
It used to be the Ohio Historical Society, and then they changed the name to the Ohio History Connection, and they distanced themselves from that idea that it's a volunteer society, that we're a corporation.
Okay.
So wild.
Well, I appreciate you kind of giving that perspective a little bit, and I would
Yeah.
be more than happy to oblige any type of conversation on both sides of
Right.
the fence.
Right.
It'd be interesting to talk to Graham. It'd be interesting to talk to the person that involved with the email. I like to see every side of each story. And I think Jeff has a unique perspective with the stuff that was going on with Ancient Apocalypses. He was involved with the episode and was able to help the production crew during that, and
Right.
provided some amazing drone footage
Oh, thanks.
to the production as well, by the way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Jeff's been cool enough to lend us some of his drone footage as well. And what you have, like over 1,000 hours or something insane, or
Well, I usually take still photography.
Yeah.
That's kind of my thing. I try to intentionally, remember I had that discussion about iconic imagery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I try to get photographs that become like iconic imagery. I'm sure you're
Yeah,
going to
he's
show
got some great
some
images.
aerial drone shots here. So I have not really focused on film photography much.
Gotcha.
But Graham's production, they wanted certain shots. They did hire a secondary drone company, Drone Ohio. Shout out to Drone Ohio.
What's up,
Nice.
Drone Ohio?
They were up in Cleveland. They came down. I helped facilitate their production, and they, the production liked a lot of my drone footage too, so they used both
Well,
in the
you've
episode.
So many
lot of practice.
practice of what
So I think over the last
to
3
fly in
or
at.
4 years, I've taken probably about 70,000 aerial images of Serpent Mound. I very rarely post them. Maybe once every couple of months I'll post a couple, because I think that if I just dumped 70,000 aerial
Yeah, for
images of
sure.
Serpent Mound out there, it becomes a little less special.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
And
for sure.
So I try to be very selective. I try to put pictures out there
Craft that image.
that really speak to people,
Yeah.
and impress. Wow, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But it allowed me to see Serpent Mound from so many different angles.
Right.
And part of that project of doing that work over the course of several years was, of course, to take aerial alignment shots of when the sun rises and where the sun sets,
Oh, wow.
so that you can see all the astronomical alignments. And I think I have some of those
Oh,
images
yeah.
for you
Oh,
guys
I'm
to
excited
see
for that.
here.
I mean,
Since
So-
you were saying
Yeah, I
before, you
think-
don't get to
so
see them.
Right.
Yeah.
I've captured all of them.
Oh,
I've
that's
captured
fantastic.
all of the major sunrise
Well-
and sunset alignments. And, we've even got a couple of ground level views from before they, kind of started restricting the park a little bit.
Yeah.
Where I did some time-lapse photography of showing the alignments
Oh, cool.
happen while you stand there on the ground and watch it happen.
Oh, very cool.
So we'll at least see one of those for sure. So.
yeah, and just kind of to let everybody know that eventually this is going to be available on all of our podcast platforms.
Yeah.
And this episode is pretty heavily visual.
Visually intensive.
So, obviously come to the YouTube channel if here in the near future when this airs. If you want to see these images, head to the youtube.com/thestrangeroad.
We'll be descriptive though. We'll really spell out what we're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is a good point now. I think building kind of a base. We've talked about a lot of great things, but let's dig into the people early on that really, so many earthworks were being destroyed systematically all over the country in the 1800s and 1900s that it's amazing that we still have as many as we do now. Someone's estimated there was at least 10,000 earthworks and mounds in Ohio alone.
Right.
And maybe we have less than 1,000 that are,
depending on how you count them.
Because
around 1,000.
temple complexes
Or
versus
private land.
Newark, only the circle and the octagons really left.
Yeah.
But there was a whole giant site that took up essentially the whole city of Newark.
Yep.
And that's kind of been in the news with the Great Octagon and the lease, so I don't want to get into that. Right, it's a whole episode. But Jeff, if you want to take us through kind of how you tapped in, so.
Let me talk a little bit about the early history of Serpent Mound.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm actually finishing up a book. It should be out before the end of the year. I'm just finishing up the indexing right now. I'm re-releasing a book called Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. It's an expanded edition. It'll have about 400 additional pages.
Oh, cool.
Okay. Most people that are interested in the mounds and the earthworks, they come across Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley pretty quickly because that's a book that has been referred back to
Squire
by
and
everybody.
Davis.
Squire and Davis were the authors. And the book that I'm writing came about because I've been trying to put together a comprehensive volume about Serpent Mound.
Okay.
And Squire and Davis's book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, had the first published account of Serpent Mound in it, and they included kind of an illustration, kind of an overhead view map of Serpent Mound. And I went back to kind of fact check what they had written about Serpent Mound. They got several factual details incorrect. But one of the things I realized when I looked at that imagery, and I've been looking at it for a long time, is that Squire and Davis didn't do that illustration of Serpent Mound, which is a pretty famous one. Actually, they didn't do any of the illustrations for Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, although they have been given credit for that for the last 175 years. This is the 175th anniversary of the publication of by the Smithsonian of Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. And so the people who did the illustrations, all of the major maps that are in the book, what they call plates, those were done by a lithographic company in New York City called Cerrone and Major, Nicholas Cerrone and Henry Major. And they did all of the illustrations through a lithographic print process. I don't know if you're familiar with a lithographic process, but essentially they're looking at a drawing and they transfer that drawing in mirror image onto a wax-coated stone plate. And they essentially scrape, they etch the wax away, and then they apply an acid over the top of it, which etches that into the stone. It doesn't eat away the wax. They wash all that off, and then they apply the ink, and then they stamp the paper. And that's how they made those illustrations for Ancient Monuments.
Dude.
Well,
talk about analog.
I realized that illustration, they were working off of a drawing that was done by somebody else.
Okay.
And I did like a Hail Mary research pass. Could I find it? Could I find that original drawing? Does it still exist anywhere? And I did. I managed to find the original Serpent Mound illustration, as well as probably about 95% of all the other illustrations, the major plates that are in Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. None of it has ever been published before.
Now, when you say you found them,
yes,
are we talking like physically found them or digitally
found them
in archives?
Physically.
Okay,
Yeah,
wow.
Almost none of it's been digitized.
Wow.
Most of it I found in a collection of papers by Squire, the E.G. Squire papers at the Library of Congress.
Oh, wow.
Subsequently, I managed to find several other collections of papers by people who contributed to Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, and their original maps and their original drawings that Squire worked off of. And the artists worked off of. And so the book, which Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley Expanded Edition, will have the original, exactly the same text pagination, but whenever you hit a plate, you'll see the original drawing by the original surveyor, and then I've written some historical context about each one of those, because Squire and Davis really only did about 28% of all of the surveys that are in the book.
Okay,
even though they've been given credit for all of it.
Contracting it out.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't contract it out. They basically stole it from other people.
So they went ahead and literally just came in later. And
yes. Yeah, these people all these other people were doing their work, 20 to 25 years before Squire.
Wow.
And Davis. So I have stuff that dates back all the way to the 1700s.
What?
Illustrations that are going to be in the book.
What a find.
And almost,
Dang.
I would say, probably 95% of what is in the book has never been published previously. So that
super sleuth.
I was able to find, the original Serpent Mound illustration. Plus, I found Squire's original field notebooks, and they had the original field notes for Serpent Mound as well. So that is all material that no one's ever seen before.
That's really cool.
None of the archaeologists ever cited it.
No one alive, for sure, right? Or I mean, it's not like, are there professors at universities across the country or anywhere that are looking for this kind of stuff, or has anybody?
Not really.
So you were kind of the modern person that is bringing, and this is all pretty recent, right? I mean, this is
this book won't come out for a couple of weeks yet.
But finding the images, that's all within this year.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Last December or last November and December was when I looked through the Library of Congress material, and then subsequently over the past 6 months or so, I've found all these other collections of material. And so
are there archives in Ohio that you can go to? Like if someone wanted to go and research this stuff, like where would they start here in Ohio if you wanted to go start digging in?
So there are probably three major collections. One would be the collection that I use the most is at the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland.
Okay.
They hold the Charles Whittlesley papers. Whittlesley contributed quite a bit to the book. Charles Whittlesley was part of the Ohio Geological Survey in 1837, 38, 39, and they did many, many earthwork surveys. Quite a few of those were for the first time published in Ancient Monuments. And so Whittlesley is credited in Ancient Monuments as doing a lot of it. He did about, I want to say, maybe about 15% of all of the surveys in Ancient Monuments were done by Charles Whittlesley. So his papers are at the Western Reserve, as well as Squire's original field notebooks. And so that's where I went and looked at those.
Wow.
The guy who contributed the most to Ancient Monuments is actually a guy by the name of James McBride.
Mm-hmm.
James McBride was from Hamilton, the city of Hamilton. He did a lot of work in Hamilton and Butler County, surveyed dozens and dozens of sites over there. He put together these amazing handwritten, hand-lettered, leather-bound books of all of his surveys, and then lent them to Squire. Squire took them to New York, and they basically copied almost every single page in the book. And I didn't realize this until just recently. And those papers are owned by the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, which is part of Drexel University. Those papers are now on permanent loan at the OHC. And there's actually some bizarro corporate fight between who actually owns those papers now. And so I won't be able to use any of those James McBride illustrations in the book until that ownership thing gets settled, because one side says they own it, the other side says they own it, and I can't really publish it until somebody settles that. So
those won't be in.
Yeah. Now I'm quoting from all of the field notes that are in there, but I won't be able to use any of the illustrations.
So you've been in there, you found them, you just can't.
Yeah, Drexel allowed me permission to go in and photograph anything from the collection.
Drexel
which I did.
University?
Mm-hmm, yeah, the Academy of Natural Sciences did.
Okay.
But the OHC is claiming ownership now. So the other big collection is probably at the Cincinnati Museum Center. They have a collection of James McBride's other papers, as well as a lot of other collections of papers. Like, they just have a bunch of stuff. Let's put it that way. And so those would be the three main groups. Although I have found stuff in other archives as well. But for the most part, those are the three main ones that I used. Ironically, the Wisconsin Historical Society has some of the earliest earthwork illustrations from Ohio. There was a gentleman by the name of Draper back in the mid-1800s, starting around the 1840s, who was from Wisconsin, that realized that somebody needed to preserve the early papers from the first white people arriving in the Northwest Territory. And so he went around and bought and collected all of these early manuscripts.
And these are like town hall reports, antiquarian journals,
or all kinds of collections of papers.
So there's like
he went and interviewed a lot of people before they died. And so he collected all kinds of stuff. And one of the major collections from a guy by the name of Dr. Daniel Drake, many of his early illustrations are probably the earliest illustrations of a lot of the earthwork sites, like the Hopewell Earthworks or Spruce Hill or Circleville. Those will be in the book. Those have never been published before. They were part of the Draper manuscript collection at the Wisconsin Historical Society.
Oh, wow.
So I was able to access those collections, and that stuff will be in the book. So there's
incredible.
There's a lot of stuff that people have never seen before, and it's going to hopefully change the narrative about how archaeologists identify primary source documents. Because for the last 175 years, almost universally, everybody refers back to Squire and Davis as the primary source document, and that is completely not true.
And we're missing
these
all
collections
these
of all this work
older
by all
stuff.
these other people is what Squire used to make the book.
Right.
And none of these other people have gotten credit. People like, like I mentioned, Daniel Drake or Charles Whittlesley or James McBride or Constantine Raffinesque.
There was a guy
down
from
in
Kentucky.
Yeah, Constantine Raffinesque.
Yeah. He was like a farmer or something.
Raffinesque contributed,
Yeah.
Raffinesque was dead before Squire even started,
Right.
Before Squire ever moved to Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
He actually was a contemporary with Daniel Drake, knew Daniel Drake, and Caleb Atwater from Circleville. And those guys did, their versions of ancient monuments 25 years before Squire and Davis.
Right.
Yep.
And then Squire and Davis basically reused a lot of their material. They just redrew it, essentially.
Yep.
And so, there are these earlier pioneers who did all this work that I'm hopefully going to shine a light on them and give credit
That's
to
really
them.
cool.
And
Oh,
Yeah.
man, that's
little
great.
mini biographies of some of those
Yeah.
people that never really got, who actually did this work, right? So I went through and did all this primary source stuff. There's been very, very few references to, like, the collection of Squire papers at the Library of Congress. The first one that I ran across was there was a reproduction of ancient monuments in the Mississippi Valley in 1973 by Harvard University's AMS Press. They produced one, and it had a new introduction written by a professor of archaeology at University of Michigan, James Griffin, who was probably, out of all the archaeologists I've ever run across and studied, that guy knew more than just about anybody else I've ever come across.
Wow.
And he really knew his stuff. He was like a pottery savant. He went around and visited every collection of pottery across the eastern United States and studied it and wrote about it. And, he was the first guy to really set up carbon dating at the University of Michigan. They were the first ones to really kind of start doing carbon dating.
Oh, wow.
He was just a tour de force of an archaeologist. And in his introduction in the 1973 edition to Ancient Monuments, he mentions in a short paragraph that he had viewed Squier's papers at the Library of Congress and found it that was interesting that the drawings, the draft illustrations, had differences than what was actually published.
So he's noticing that Squier's drawings aren't the published.
And he says, but it's out of the scope of this introduction. We don't have time to cover it. Done. That's it. It's like 2 sentences.
Just mentions it.
Just mentions it, right? And no follow-up. Nobody ever followed up. Not a single archaeologist has ever gone in there and looked at any of this material. They've never published it and never cited it, even. There was a biography written about Squier by a guy by the name of Terry Barnhart. Terry Barnhart was an amazing historian who wrote this biography of Squier, plus he wrote many other long articles, did his doctoral dissertation on Squier and Davis, wrote long articles on James McBride and Squier and Davis, but he never accessed the James McBride papers. He even was an employee of the OHC at one point that they had the papers in their collection, and he never even accessed them and wrote this long historical thing about James McBride. He wrote, and he went to the Library of Congress and reviewed all these letters that are in the Squier Papers collection, and all of the pictures that he shows in his book from Ancient Monuments are the published versions. He doesn't even mention that there are any drawings or draft illustrations at all. And it's like this really comprehensive biography, and he doesn't even access this stuff. It's like
purposefully glazes over it.
I was astonished, absolutely shocked when I uncovered this material, because all I'm doing is I'm looking for a picture of Serpent Mound, like some sketch or whatever. And I came across just this unbelievable amount of material. So I set my Serpent Mound book project aside and did this first.
Okay.
And then I'm going to go back and finish the Serpent Mound volumes. The book will be called the Serpent Mound Chronicles, and it'll be a book series because I can't fit it all into one volume.
So you're just like
fantastic.
getting taken over here through this process. You're getting pulled off of as you go down the line. There's just more and more stuff, and it's taking you this way and this way.
Yeah, because you have to start with the primary source stuff.
Right.
And so now I got to reset everybody. I got to, hit the reset button and go back to this original material.
Yep.
Before Squier and Davis. And so in the process, I've uncovered probably 6 or 7 new illustrations of Serpent Mound that predate Squier and Davis's Ancient Monuments in Mississippi Valley, which is credited as the first publication. I found several illustrations of Serpent Mound that predate that, and that'll be in these books. So
that's really cool.
That's incredible.
That's so cool.
It's stuff that, is out there in these archives, and that, it's not been digitized, yet.
Right.
At some point maybe it will be, but so far at this point it has not.
Right.
And so
that's cool.
I think that gives us a good segue. You were telling us a little earlier about the first folks that helped protect the Serpent Mound. So let's kind of paint the picture here of Squier and Davis's book. Then
published in 1848.
Then who comes along, and in between that time, is it just the Wild West? Like it's just overgrowing. There's nobody protecting the site.
There was a guy that owned the site. His name was J.J. Lovett. And sometime around, it's unclear, but it's likely in 1859, there was a major storm system that rolled through the Midwest. In the literature talking about this incident, they said that there was a tornado that came across Serpent Mound and took down all the trees. But I went back into the newspaper archives to find out whether or not, there was an article written about that.
Right.
There was no article written about that. But during that period of time, there was this massive storm that ran across the entire Midwest and that spawned tornadoes and basically straight line winds that did damage in like every Midwestern city from, the western side of Kentucky all the way into Pennsylvania. And so all this damage, was done across these places. And so whatever it was, whether it was a tornado specifically or straight line winds, it took down all the trees on the site.
Okay.
And so a group of loggers built a road in that crossed Brush Creek, which is on the west side of Serpent Mound, and into the area, cleared all the fallen trees out. And once they did that, then they began to farm up there on the plateau where Serpent Mound is. And so they started farming probably around 1860. And so they're farming. And then in 1883, a person from Harvard University by the name of Frederick Putnam, who was the curator of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, he took a trip across the state of Ohio. He actually began his trip in Wisconsin, then came down to Ohio, met up with some people in Ohio, and five guys, including Putnam, went by, horse and buggy across southern Ohio. They would go about 17 miles each day, stop at another mound, and then dig it up. And then they would, camp there, and then they would move on to the next place. And it was a bit like a camping trip. I found some illustrations from one of the guys who was on the camping trip, a guy by the name of Dr. Charles Metz, who was kind of an avocational archaeologist.
Okay.
Began excavating outside of Cincinnati in the early 1870s at a place called the Madisonville site, and sites in and around there. And he was one of the people on the trip, and I found these in his collection of papers. He had done these little sketch cartoons of the camping trip. This guy boozing it up, and this guy with X's on his eyes,
Hammered.
Putnam carrying a watermelon, this kind of stuff. And so it was a bit like a frat boy camping trip. What kind of entertainment is there than to go out and camp and dig up an Indian mound? And that's what they did.
So
they
wild.
kind of moved across the state.
Whoa.
And they got to Serpent
good old
Mound.
time.
That's wild.
They made it to Serpent Mound, and they were farming over part of it. It was mostly in corn, but like from the main body of the serpent up through the head was not being farmed over, but the tail was. And so they had it was a big cornfield. So they had one of Putnam's archaeology students, John Cone Kimball, took all of the photographs. He had one of these box cameras on. They took photographs on glass plates.
Some of those are cool. Those images.
And they took the first, photographs of Serpent Mound, 1883. And
wow,
that was first week of September. They were there, and they arrived just a few days after the eruption of Krakatoa in the South Pacific.
Wow,
one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, human memory. And that kicked up something like, 5 cubic miles of sand and ash into the atmosphere. Killed tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
Well, that created a whole series of unbelievable sunsets in the sky for about the next year or so.
Because of all the particulate in the air?
All the particulates in the air. And so when Putnam got back to Boston after his trip to Serpent Mound, he wrote this article to the local Boston Herald paper, kind of romantically writing about how beautiful it was in southern Ohio because of the amazing sunsets. Had no idea that was because of Krakatoa.
Yeah.
But that imagery that he wrote about became that sort of, indelible
seed,
imagination, iconic imagery in people's minds about how beautiful Serpent Mound was, how amazing
this
Serpent
wonderment
Mound was.
of the site.
And so when he was at Serpent Mound, they cleared all of the corn and vegetation off the tail, and they took a picture of the tail. But they cleared all the vegetation off of Serpent Mound because the grass is growing up and stuff so that people could see it. They got a bunch of locals to come in and clear all this off. And then the eruption of Krakatoa, the environmental after effects of that were significant worldwide. The following year was known as the year without a summer. It rained. It was cold. There was crop failures around the world, and so on and so forth. And Putnam doesn't come back to Serpent Mound in 1884. Comes back in 1885, and what does he find? Well, Serpent Mound looks like it's like eroding away. There's massive erosion damage all over the Serpent. Doesn't identify that was because of him, because they took all the vegetation off of it.
Yeah.
He attributes it to it must be people digging into it or whatever. So he writes another letter to the Boston Herald and says, somebody should do something. Not him, but somebody should do something, because otherwise this is going to be gone. Well, that somebody turned out to be a woman by the name of Alice Fletcher.
Okay.
And Alice Fletcher,
That's who we have up
that's
there?
a picture up there of Alice Fletcher. Alice Fletcher was an amazing woman, just an absolutely amazing woman. In the early part of her career, she served as kind of the teacher / nanny to this wealthy family in New York City. And when the kids came of age, the wealthy parents said, well, we don't need you as a teacher anymore, but we've taken a portion of your pay throughout the whole many years that you've done this for our children. I guess this guy was some kind of wealthy Wall Street investor where I invested a bunch of money for her, and so she became sort of financially independent.
Oh, cool.
And so
nice parting gift.
She wanted to do something good with her money.
She was invited to become part of the very first women's organization ever organized in the United States. It was called Sorosis, like the root word of sorority. And so this women's organization organizes in the early 1870s, coming out of the Civil War, in New York City, and she becomes the secretary of the organization. And her role was to organize the very first women's Congress in the United States. And so they got together all of these women who had been active in the fight to end slavery, the war against, alcohol. They were also the people that were involved, they called that the temperance movement.
Old school liberals.
They were also the women that were active in wanting women's suffrage, right? The right to vote, right?
Right.
Yep.
And so
Early feminists.
They collected
movements.
These women from across the country, and they came together in a women's congress, and they formed the Association for the Advancement of Women. And
That's so cool,
and
too.
she was elected the permanent secretary of the Association for the Advancement of Women. The person who became the president of it was a woman by the name of Mary Livermore. Mary Livermore had an organization in Boston known as the Ladies of Boston. And the Ladies of Boston were very much interested in preserving the origins of the United States. How did the United States come to be in the American Revolution?
Okay.
They looked at places like the old meeting house in Boston where the revolutionaries planned the Revolutionary War, and that building was falling into ruin. And they said, we should save this and preserve this as a monument to American history, right? And so they raised the money to purchase the old meeting house. Now, at the time, women aren't allowed to own property, okay? So they convinced their husbands or whatever to purchase that and preserve it on their behalf, but they were the ones that raised all the money to do that.
That's wild.
Okay, so she took the letter that Putnam wrote in the paper to her old friend Mary Livermore from the Association for the Advancement of Women and the Ladies of Boston, read the letter to the Ladies of Boston. Okay, now the Ladies of Boston were concerned about what was happening in American society at the time. So you have to think about what was happening in the early 1880s. You had just had a president assassinated, right? Mm-hmm. You were coming off of the Civil War. You're just within about a decade of the end of the Civil War. You had the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Right. There are no worker protection laws, no child labor laws. There's no public education. There are waves of immigrants coming to the United States to flee the wars in Europe and the financial devastation from like the Panic of 1873, which was a worldwide. It was called the Great Depression before the Great Depression.
Wow.
Now historians call it the Long Depression, because it lasted for more than 10 years. There were all these major societal upheavals that were taking place in the United States. And they said, looking around the country, like the country's coming apart at the seams.
Kind of
right?
like the 60s in a way.
Yeah. And they said, the old Puritan ideals that stitch this country together aren't working.
Right.
We need to find something that when all these people come into the United States, the idea was, what does it mean to be an American?
Who are we?
Yeah.
Right.
And when Alice Fletcher took that letter to the ladies of Boston, she said, look, if you really want to know what it means to be an American, you have to go back to the earliest heritage of this country, which is the people that built all of this ancient stuff.
Right.
Right?
Whoa.
People that built places like Serpent Mound. And so the ladies of Boston got together and they raised all the money to purchase Serpent Mound so that they could preserve it as a symbol to teach people what does it mean to be an American.
Wow.
Okay? And that the park was to be free to the public so that anybody, no matter what their social status was, no matter how much money they had, whatever it was, you could go and you could learn about our shared collective deep heritage of this country. Okay? Again, women aren't allowed to own property. So they turned to the trustees of the Peabody Museum where Putnam worked. They turned over all of the money. 150% of the purchase price was how much money they raised. The rest of the money went to lay out the park and conduct the archaeological excavations over the next 4 years, which is what Putnam did. All right, but it was really these ladies of Boston that were the ones that preserved Serpent Mound.
That's so wild.
Okay, and the only reference to that when you go to Serpent Mound is there's one sentence on this granite monument. Now, the granite monument that's...
I'm going to hand you the clicker, Jeff.
Oh, that's okay. Let me take a drink of water here real quick.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're getting into it now.
So this granite monument, 2 pictures here. The one on the right...
You guys keep that. I'll be right back.
The one on the right is how it looks today. The other picture is a postcard from the early 1900s after it was put up. And the reason that these 2 pictures I put up here side by side is to show how this monument has changed a little bit over time.
Yeah.
But in the middle of that, there is a sentence in there that mentions the ladies of Boston. That Serpent Mound was obtained by subscription by the ladies of Boston. And when I was a volunteer at Serpent Mound in the early 2000s and I read this, I was like, who are these ladies of Boston? Nobody writes about. There's nothing written about the ladies of Boston.
That's all you see.
That's all you see. There's nothing about them. It doesn't identify them. And what is this about subscription? What does that mean? What do you mean they obtained it by subscription? I don't understand this. Nobody had any answers for me because nobody at the park knew anything about it. They don't have anything in the museum about it. There's nothing written about it.
They don't even know about it.
Well, they didn't.
That's so wild.
And so I went on a hunt to find out who these people were. And I uncovered their story.
How did that get lost over time? Because
because all that's referenced on there is the story from this granite monument. This granite monument was put up to fulfill a deed requirement when Harvard Peabody Museum transferred the property's ownership from Harvard to the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society in 1900. They had 2 deed restrictions on the property. One was they had to put up a monument that told the story of how Serpent Mound was preserved. And the second one was that the park was to be free to the public forever.
Yeah.
That's the language in the deed.
Yeah.
And it's a reversion clause. So if the owners of the park don't live up to the deed, then the park reverts its ownership back to Harvard University's Peabody Museum. And so this granite monument exists to fulfill the first part of the deed restriction. So this was put up in the early 1900s, and it says, Serpent Mound was saved from destruction by Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard University's Peabody Museum. And then it, like as an aside, obtained by subscription by the ladies of Boston. So from the very get-go, the focus has been on the guy.
Yeah.
This guy,
Sounds
he's the
about
guy
right.
that saved it, right?
Sounds about right.
Well,
as
he wrote the
history
letter.
goes.
He wrote the letter that appealed for it, but
Right.
but these women are the ones that saved it.
100%.
100%.
Sure.
Right. So, but at the very bottom of this monument, you can look at the last line there, and it
Yep.
says, "As a free public park."
Yep.
Well, for many years, this granite monument used to sit. They placed it on top of the largest burial mound at the park. And for decades, it sat on the top of that burial mound. And eventually sunk in a little bit. And in the 1980s, late 1980s, they decided to move the monument. And they moved it closer to Serpent Mound, where the location is to today.
Okay.
And when they did that, they sandblasted off that last line.
Added a period on the end, and everything's
Yeah,
good.
instead of as, they changed that as into a period.
Yep.
And got rid of the free public park part, and then they started charging money to park.
So does this void the deed?
Well, according to OHC's lawyers, no, because they only charge you to park there. They don't charge you to go and see the serpent.
and see the site itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can walk into the park for free.
But with your car, you have to.
But if you're driving there,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pilgrimage to get to Serpent Mound, right?
Yeah,
I wonder
so-
if people know that.
You got to get through the crater barrier.
Generally, most people do not.
You know, you should. Well,
I wrote an article many years ago that appeared in a local traveler visitors bureau magazine. They asked me to write an article about who owns Serpent Mound because there was a lot of confusion. Most people believe that it's owned by the state of Ohio.
sure.
And that isn't the case.
Right.
It's owned by this private corporation, which nobody understands that it's owned by a private corporation.
Right.
They all think it's owned, it's like some kind of state park. The Ohio Historical Society, many years ago, came up with this scheme. They called it a state memorial. And there's nothing about a state memorial. They just came up with that idea. They named it a state memorial. And they named a couple of their other parks state memorials. And so it became this link that, it must be a state park. It says it's a state memorial. It's the Ohio Historical Society State Memorial. Must be owned by the state. And that's totally not the case.
Not
they
at all.
Federal Express.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they
Or the Fed.
intentionally confused the public, over time that it was somehow owned by the state. And so people, for the longest time, have thought, oh my gosh, no, it's wholly owned by this private corporation.
Gotcha.
And so that's, transferred from Harvard to the private corporation. And there's a whole story around that, but probably shouldn't get into. But nevertheless, this monument exists to tell the story, and it's the only story that they tell. This is the narrative, all right? Saved from Destruction by Putnam, Ladies of Boston is a sideshow, right? But they're the real thing, right? That's
They
the
did
real
the real
story.
work.
Right. All right, so you want me to keep moving here? So.
Yeah, up to you,
Okay.
man. Yeah, I
Yeah,
just figured
wherever
I'd give
you
you
wanna go with
control.
it.
So, I must be going backwards.
Yep.
There we
All
go.
right, so I just thought that we could maybe cover, for most people, they're generally unaware of the ancient Ohio timeline,
Sure.
the
yeah.
various cultures of people that have lived in Ohio.
I'm there with you. Yeah, let's
All
see
right.
this.
So I thought maybe we would start at the bottom and work our way up instead of from the oldest to the newest, just so that when we end up at the oldest, we can talk about how that links back into what Graham was saying about, in Ancient Apocalypse. But the most recent sort of time period that historians and archaeologists have pieced together is from about 1600 to 1673. They call that the proto-historic era. It's about the era that Europeans started to arrive in this area. And so whoever was living here, they call those sort of before the modern day tribal people, right?
Okay.
Just slightly before that. Okay. And then from about 1100 to 1600, the immediate time frame before that proto-historic era, that's where the archaeologists call the Fort Ancient era.
Okay.
And particularly in southern Ohio, these people had a particular life way. different things that they would do. How they buried their dead was different. How they, what they were eating, how they were growing their food, what kind of villages they were building. They had a particular life way, and they call that the Fort Ancient people. It has nothing to do with Fort Ancient, the earthwork.
Yeah, so that's always confusing to
confusing.
me, because we stopped at Fort Ancient on the way back.
Fort Ancient was built by an earlier people about 1,000 years before the Fort Ancient, but they found remnants of this culture living inside of Fort Ancient's earthwork. And so they became, this is a terrible practice that archaeologists do. They name the culture after the property or the property owner.
Adena was a guy, right?
No. Adena, I'll get to Adena in a second. But so Fort Ancient, the earthwork, had already been named that by early settlers. That name got attached to this group of people and their lifeways because they found a village site, so to speak, inside of the earthwork walls.
Okay.
All right. So it becomes very confusing for the public. Before that, from about 600 CE or AD, as some people think, to about 1000 AD, there was a group of people here in Ohio that were known as the intrusive burial mound culture. And there's not been a lot that's known about this group of people, other than that they used to bury their dead into mounds that had already been built by earlier cultures.
Okay. They're like, hey, we're going to use
intrusive
this
burial, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
they're going to bury their, they're probably descended from those peoples, and so they, there's a bit of ancestor, veneration going on, kind of thing. Maybe family burial plots, or who knows what.
Sure.
So that's that group, that period of time. Prior to them, before the intrusive burial mound culture, from about 100 BC to about 500 AD. That's the period of time that archaeologists have identified as the Hopewell people, or they're also now kind of trying to get away from that nomenclature, and they're calling this part the Woodland period, more generic term, because archaeologists have finally realized how problematic their naming convention has been. And, identifying a group of people as the Hopewell, for instance, that's named after the farm in which there was a series of mounds that were excavated. And the guy that owned the farm was Mordecai C. Hopewell, former Confederate war soldier. And so they've labeled this whole major culture with
after farmer,
after some Confederate soldier, Mordecai Hopewell. It's like ridiculous, right? And so
that's bizarre.
And so they're trying to move away from that nomenclature, and they're now it's called the Woodland period, more generic. And so there's an early, middle, and late Woodland period. And so it's problematic for the Hopewell Culture National Historic Park, in Chillicothe, run by the National Park Service, because they understand, they know the history of how that name came about, right? Those earthworks, the Hopewell earthworks specifically, were excavated they were excavated for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893.
Really?
In the lead up to that, they paid for all the excavations and all those artifacts from that site. They collected about 400,000 artifacts, went on display during the Chicago World's Fair, and it became known as Hopewell's Site, and then that got shortened to Hopewell's. It's the Hopewell's people, and it was kind of a big deal.
That's wild.
If you want to go see any of those artifacts, some of those artifacts, a selection of the more amazing ones, are on display at the Chicago Field Museum in Chicago.
Museum.
Because that museum was the sort of outcome of the Chicago World's Fair.
Okay.
Everything that went on display, for the Chicago World's Fair got incorporated into the Chicago Field Museum.
Cool.
All right. So
now, is that the one that you walk up and it's just a blank giant field? There's actually no earthworks?
Well, yeah, sort of.
There's a plaque where it shows where they used to be,
Yeah, there's
But
very
when
little remnant of
I've
what's
gone
there.
out there, I'm like, there's nothing here.
Well, if you go up and hike the hiking trail up onto the ridge that kind of overlooks that big field,
Yeah.
some of the earthen walls that are up there are still relatively intact.
Yeah.
Because they weren't farmed over down below.
That was a big site.
It is enormous.
Huge.
It's absolutely enormous. Just gigantic.
Like half
site.
moon hedges.
And that's where the largest Hopewellian earthwork mound, was excavated. And it's been excavated repeatedly. Warren K. Moorhead, on behalf of the Chicago, World's Fair, excavated. In fact, Putnam was hired by the Chicago World's Fair to organize all the excavations, and he hired Moorhead to do those excavations. So Putnam was involved in those excavations. He also sent archaeologists all across North America and South America, and they did excavations all over the place, and all of that stuff went on display at the Chicago World's Fair.
Wow.
Gosh, can you imagine seeing that?
Yeah, so, so before the Hopewell, the immediate period before them, from about 1200 BC to about 100 AD, there's a little bit of overlap between the two. That's the Adena era, the Adena people. They're named after a mansion.
Right, in Chillicothe.
So there was a mound on a property that was named by one of the early governors of Ohio, Thomas Worthington, in Chillicothe. He built a mansion there. He named his mansion Adena. This mound was on the Adena property. They wanted to level the mound in the early 1900s to do some farming there. And so the Ohio Historical Society went in there and excavated it, and it became known as the Adena Mound. And that then became associated with the culture of people that built those. So that is the Adena culture, named after the mansion.
Yeah, this is terrible nomenclature.
Yeah.
Brutal. Just
ridiculous.
Bad.
I think that would have corrected itself over 100 years.
Yeah.
What do you want to call it
just
today?
over the last-
How about Doritos? Yeah, the Dorito culture.
Right.
It's ridiculous.
Right. So prior to that, that's before the Woodland period.
Okay.
There's an immense amount of time from 8000 BC to 1000 BC. That's known as the Archaic era. And you can sometimes find subdivisions in there, early, middle, and late Archaic. Once you get into the late Archaic, there's a kind of an interesting, what you might call a proto-culture, what they call the Glacial Came people, that not much is known about them other than they used to bury their dead into geologic features known as glacial cames.
Okay.
So the glaciers came into Ohio, and when they retreated, they left these giant piles of gravel, essentially.
Yeah.
And those are called glacial cames. And for whatever reason, these people would bury their dead into them. They would cover them with red ochre sometimes. There was some ceremonialism there. They appear to be like the early forerunners of the Adena. So you're seeing like sort of the beginnings of how they kind of came about.
Gotcha.
And so before 8000 BC, going as far back in time as you want, probably at least to 18,000 BC, that is the Paleolithic era. And that is where you get into what Graham is talking about.
I was just going to say, yeah.
So once you get into, the Younger Dryas is in this period of time. And before that, you have, the last glacial maximum, which, extended almost to Serpent Mound, but not quite.
That's wild.
Okay, so that glacier came down and stopped just to the north of Fort Hill, which is about 5 miles north of Serpent Mound in air distance. Okay, so that glacier stopped, and I've told this story. I used to tell this story when we used to take people on tours of the crater for Geology Day. People always ask the question, well, were there people here back then? Well, yeah, there are archaeological sites that date back to the Paleolithic here in Ohio. In fact, there is one in Adams County, one of the largest Paleolithic sites east of the Mississippi River. It's right along the Ohio River, down on Ohio State Route 52. Down there used to be a historical marker. I think it got stolen a couple years ago. It's known as the Sandy Springs Archaeological District.
Okay.
And back in the 70s, people were finding Paleolithic artifacts in these farm fields down there along the Ohio River. And they went down there, the Ohio Historical Society did a shovel test in which they did this big area of basically digging just barely into the ground and see if they could find artifacts. And they found tons of
stuff.
Paleolithic and Archaic era stuff down there. It's where Brush Creek empties into the Ohio River. These fields down at the mouth of Brush Creek. Well, you take Brush Creek, you just go all the way up to Serpent Mound, and Putnam, when he excavated at Serpent Mound after Harvard acquired the property, there are artifacts that date back to the Paleolithic in the collection that Putnam excavated. So we know that people from the Paleolithic were there, right, at Serpent Mound.
Right.
Whether, and we're not saying Serpent Mound was built there at that time,
right,
but people were there.
People
were
there.
leaving that.
Right.
Could have been a basic ceremonial
every single
spot.
one of these cultures, going all the way back to the Paleolithic, left artifacts at Serpent Mound. Putnam collected from every single one of these cultures. So that was discussion that Graham and I had prior to America Before, was Serpent Mound is way, way older than, as an archaeological site, than what people are crediting it for. It dates all the way back to the Paleolithic.
Even if the mound itself wasn't there, there
Correct.
was ceremony, there was something special.
People were living there.
People were
And
there.
I
so-
think it was the impact crater.
Well, so people coming up from the south, from that Paleolithic site on the Ohio River, if you're coming up from the south, you would reach the southern rim of the crater, just if you're following Brush Creek, just south of Serpent Mound. Serpent Mound is in the southwest section of the crater. You can stand on the rim of the crater, see Serpent Mound down there. From that southern rim, you can also see Fort Hill in the distance, 5 miles to the north of Serpent Mound. And right there, just to the north of Fort Hill, was where the glacier stopped.
Right.
So if you were from a person from the
Yeah.
Paleolithic and you got to the crater, you would stand there, you'd see this giant circle in the ground, and then beyond that,
Just ice.
2 miles of ice going up into the sky.
Wow, dude.
What?
It was still there.
Serpent
I'm saying
Mound.
that much ice that tall.
Yeah, Serpent Mound, and that crater was literally the last place on Earth
That's
you could
incredible.
go going north in Ohio at one point, right? So
So of course there were sites there.
possibly.
They're
I mean,
making it all the way up. Oh, we're good. Let's settle here.
Well, you can't go any further.
go any
yeah.
yeah,
farther.
exactly.
Right. So I always try to invoke that imagery for people to understand that the environment has changed dramatically over the course of this human history that we can document.
Right.
It's changed repeatedly. You had the major catastrophe during the Younger Dryas, the worldwide catastrophe, that affected these people, right? But that's not talked about in the archaeological literature. Nobody identifies these sorts of big ideas.
Yeah.
Graham does. Graham,
Yeah.
kind of understands that, but it's not really discussed much in the archaeological literature.
Right.
The fauna, the animals that people were hunting were wildly different, right? Most of those big giant animals
Right.
are extinct.
The megafauna.
The
fauna
megafauna.
all died
You know,
off.
what people were eating,
Woolly
what people were doing,
rhinos
what kind of rocks they were, building for their tools and stuff. All that's different. And that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years before you get to the woodland period,
Right. Right.
right? So this is a period of human history that we know the barest, tiniest fraction of. Remember, these are people just like you and me, same IQ bandwidth as you and me. They're modern anatomic humans,
yeah.
modern humans. We don't know the tiniest fraction of our own history.
That's very scary.
Okay,
That's so
that's
strange.
what Graham is saying about we're a species with amnesia.
Yeah.
We don't get it. We
Right.
don't understand it. How much of that heritage can we put back together? Why is that important for us today?
Well,
right?
how many people were left after if these impacts, which, like you said, the Younger Dryas, it's documented. The geology Randall Carlson talks about, where these massive meltwater sheds come down, how much
There's some of that.
data
There's
would
some of
be
that around
left?
Serpent Mound.
How much would be left for those people to put the pieces back together and then have their oral tradition as well to continue on?
Right.
So, like, we don't have the information here in America like we do in ancient Egypt or even Mexico, where the pyramids are all still there.
Right.
I mean, I feel like they have a better grasp of that history. In North America, it's just a giant mystery still.
Yeah. So, if you look at USGS maps around Serpent Mound, if you look just to the south east of Peebles, which is about 5-6 miles from Serpent Mound, there's a huge flat area before you get to the big hills of the Appalachians, right? The eastern escarpment or the western escarpment of the Appalachians. That's called Bacon Flats. Bacon Flats is there because of the meltwater from the glaciers. That was a huge glacial lake. There's also one, if you go up to Fort Hill, just to the northeast of Fort Hill, there's also another giant area. You look on the map, it says flats. There are a couple of these areas that are called flats. These are all remnants of these glacial meltwater lakes. Okay, and even Brush Creek has changed its flow. There's an old USGS map I came across from the early 1900s that showed that, I'm sure if you have any geological knowledge about ancient Ohio, there used to be something called the T.A.'s River in the T.A.'s River Valley. If you go and look on a map of south central Ohio, you have Scioto River that comes down through Columbus, through Circleville, through Chillicothe, all the way down to Portsmouth. Well, if you look at the section between Waverly and Portsmouth, on a I don't know if he can pull this up on Google right now and just pull up a Google image of it, you can see that to the east of the Scioto River, there's this weird kind of curvy area that doesn't have any trees on it that goes all the way down to the Ohio River. That's the old T.A.'s Glacial River Valley.
Interesting.
And that river was an enormous, enormous river, way bigger than the Scioto is today, right? And that went through the valley where Sipe Mound is and Spruce Hill and the Baum Earthworks. That valley is super wide. Remember?
When you drive down into Sipe,
right?
It's crazy. If you've ever driven from the west side of Sipe, like if you come in from the 71 site, 71 side, but if you come in on the other side, the east side, it's wild. Remember driving down? I'm thinking of Fort Ancient as well, but Sipe. It's just a really strange geology.
It's a very wide valley with a tiny little creek that runs down through. That's Pink Creek today. But that was a very wide river. Remember, Randall Carlson talked about this in Ancient Apocalypse in his video, talking about that the valley is way bigger than the river because in the distant past there was this massive amount of water that used to go through there that carved out the valley. Okay, so that's the landscape that we also had, although it's not necessarily connected to a mass flash flooding event like out there, like he was talking about in the Scablands. But this was, the meltwater was actually carving it out because the rivers were so much bigger, right? So we don't often, at least in these scientific disciplines, geology is its own siloed institution. Archaeology is its own siloed institution. And they don't like to cross into each other's territory and talk about each other's stuff. It happens in all scientific disciplines.
Dr. Robert Schoch and the Sphinx was in the 90s.
Right, exactly.
John Anthony West and Graham, and that was a giant.
It's not often that you can cross disciplines and do this interdisciplinary work.
Right.
One of the things I did in college.
The system's not set up for that.
Right. One of the things I did in college was a lot of interdisciplinary stuff. My master's thesis that I did on mapping the data coming from the Lunar Prospector mission on the surface of the moon, I had to work with the geology department in the earliest days of GIS to be able to map that stuff and understand what the geology of it was, that cross-discipline with astronomy, right? So we had to kind of cross those disciplines. So I'm comfortable doing that. I don't care
Right.
about these freaking silos. I'm not in academia any longer. I used to teach physics and astronomy, and I got out of academia and went into the private sector.
Right.
So I don't really care one bit about ruffling one discipline's toes versus another. I don't care about any of that stuff. So, you have to try to look at the whole body of knowledge, whether it's, botany or...
Well, it's all part of the same picture.
Right. Yes, exactly.
You can't.
It's an
look at
integrated
just
whole.
One tree out of all.
It's an
the
integrated
forest.
whole, and science
It's holistic.
tends to slice it up into little bits. And so you want to try to reconstruct it to get a better understanding of the whole.
Well, and I think
it's
that's
compartmentalized because you have an expert that focuses so
Well-
heavy in this one particular focus.
And that's the thing. You're drilling
And-
down so far, you don't see
Oftentimes,
scope.
Oftentimes,
You're-
It's not part of their field of study. Right.
I mean, it's the same thing in medicine. I mean,
So if you have another department coming in and saying, "Hey, we're seeing this, this, and this," well, no, you're not, because the archaeology, the pot shards or whatever it is,
Right.
isn't showing that data. What are you talking about? There's no such thing as a culture that was advanced that
Yeah.
predated the Younger Dryas.
I sat in
Where's
on-
the evidence?
I sat in on a Zoom presentation yesterday at the Smithsonian talking about the origins of peoples in the United States, and the presenter from Kansas, University of Kansas, she was a geneticist. So she's talking about all of the new genetic data findings that that her discipline is looking at. But she acknowledged that, well, based on what we see in the genetics, this is what the timeline says it should be. But then there was this discovery at White Sands National Park that says that, well, there's all these footprints that they found. And they excavated all these, footprints, human footprints of, adults and children walking together across this area. And they've carbon dated that to about 5,000 years older than what the genetics story is saying. How do you square that, right? So there's a lot of more interdisciplinary stuff that needs to happen to
Right.
really understand what the true picture is. And we just, collectively, I'm saying the collective we, only know the very tiniest fraction of the stuff. And, so this slide that you put up is a project that I did for this Serpent Mound Chronicles book, which will be out. This will be a chapter in the book. It's often claimed that Serpent Mound is unique. There's nothing else like it. And it's sort of true and sort of not true. Over the course of my research over the last couple of decades, I have collected about 100 examples of serpent effigies across North America. And that's what this map is showing, is all of the other serpent effigies in North America. So the green are ones made out of earth and soil. All of the white ones that you see there are made out of stone. And then there's a couple of brown ones in the middle. Those are serpent intaglios. An intaglio is almost like a reverse mound, where they've dug the shape into the ground rather than build a mound
It's
up.
a negative image.
It's like a negative image,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So intaglio. And so there's a couple of those out in Kansas. And so this is an incomplete map, I believe, but it's the most comprehensive one that I think has been done. No one else has even attempted anything like this as far as I could tell. And so I was able to map as many of the references that I could find.
What is the variance on the design from serpent to serpent?
They're all
Quite a bit?
individually unique.
Okay.
However, many of them have a lot of common attributes. So, for instance, many of them have astronomical alignments incorporated into their design.
Okay.
Many of them often have the triangle bit for the head, and some have a kind of an oval in front of that head shape. Some don't, some do. They are often found in similar locations, up on the tops of plateaus, so that you can kind of get a better view of the sky, I think.
Yeah.
So I think if you forward real quick, there's a listing there by state of how many per state that I was able to map. So
Oh, wow.
if you can pick
Look at
your
that.
state out, Wisconsin has the most, but you can see all the different ones there. And there are so many of them that have now been destroyed. And almost none of these have been carbon dated. I would say I think there's only 2, Serpent Mound in Adams County, and then there's a Serpent Mound up in Ontario. That those 2 have been carbon dated. I don't think there's one other one. There was one down in Florida, and actually the Florida one is the oldest. In fact, it was carbon dated about, I want to say about 3,000 years older than Serpent Mound in Adams County.
Well, it's the closest to Mexico too, and you see a lot of serpent iconography in Mexico and all the way down into South America. So
yeah, so and obviously, if you remember your ancient apocalypse, during the last glacial maximum, there was so much water taken out of the oceans that created the glaciers that water levels were lower by like 400 meters, right? So the area around Florida all the way to the Bahamas was land.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's like
there's
like a 200-mile continental shelf all along the East Coast that was not underwater.
God,
and again,
what's
if you
under
want to
there.
understand the history of this continent, you better start doing underwater archaeology because
they're interested in pirate booty.
Right. And there's almost none of that's
treasure.
ever been done. It's very, very tiny little fractions of underwater archaeology that's been done.
Right.
So, and when people talk about, hey, we know what the history of this continent is, I'm telling you just don't.
No,
we don't.
I
We
would
know
agree
the
to
tiniest little bits of pieces of it. So,
Man.
all right. So this image is an image that I put together in 2007. So it's been a while. This is the first LiDAR map that was done of an archaeological site in Ohio. I'm not an archaeologist, obviously. My degree, as I said before, was in remote sensing. I learned that the Ohio Department of Transportation received a grant from the federal government to do a pilot project of using LiDAR to map the elevation of all of the state highways.
Okay.
And State Route 73 goes right by Serpent Mound, and I thought, gosh almighty, I wonder if they captured the data of Serpent Mound with LiDAR.
Yep.
Now, there were very few archaeologists at that time that were using LiDAR for archaeology, but the technology is such that essentially you fly a plane over and you shoot a laser beam down to the ground, and it reflects some of that material, some of that back up to a sensor in the plane. And every point on the ground that it reflected off of, it gives you a latitude and longitude, an elevation, and it kind of can tell you what the material was that it reflected off of. So did it reflect off of trees, off of buildings, off of a roadway? You can then, from the data points, go in there and remove the data points that you don't want to see.
That's cool.
So you can remove all the trees, which is what I did here. And that allows you to see sort of what the landscape looks like without having to fight through all the trees. Right?
Which is what they're using down in South America and the Amazon.
Absolutely,
and they're finding all these massive cities. They're just combing back all the trees. So, boom, there they are, pyramids everywhere.
So I presented this material at a conference it's the annual conference of the Hanwakin Center for Prehistoric Astronomy and Cosmology and Landscape Studies. They're up in Wisconsin, so I went to Wisconsin and I presented this material in 2007 in August. And this LiDAR data study revealed a number of things about Serpent Mound that people had not realized before. And so this was, kind of a landmark thing. And after I showed this material to William Romaine, he had put together a project known as the Serpent Mound Project. They had gotten a permit from the Ohio Historical Society to do some excavation work and some other archaeological work at Serpent Mound, some remote sensing studies in 2011 and 2012. That was when that project ran. And so I showed them this material. They were about ready to do a new map of Serpent Mound using the traditional survey methods. You get out the little tripod with the camera and you look at somebody holding a pole in the distance, you figure out what the elevation was. And I asked him, how many data points are you going to collect for this map? And he says, well, it's going to be the most comprehensive map. We're going to spend all weekend out here. We think we'll collect about 700 or 800 data points. I said, well, see, I don't know if you can see at the bottom of the screen here, this map right here has about 83,000 data points.
Wow.
And it was accurate to within about 3 or 4 centimeters. You can actually see the asphalt pathway going around the serpent.
Yep.
I said, I don't really think you need to do that work. But they did it anyways. But the two guys, Dr. Jared Burks and Dr. Bill Romaine, they were like, what is this technology? And then they dove into it, and they started to produce papers using the same data that I was using from Ohio Department of Transportation, and they started doing other sites. Now, I did, I think, about 60 archaeological sites in Ohio. I gave a presentation in 2011 showing all kinds of LiDAR stuff about not just Serpent Mound, but all these other sites. Showing, what could be accomplished and what you could see. And so, it's a bit of, again, this technology was not a tool for archaeologists. It's outside of their discipline. This is one of those interdisciplinary things. If other people that had GIS background and this ability to do remote sensing mapping came along and showed the value of using tools like this to archaeologists, and then they adopted it after the fact.
I mean, this seems like, why would you not want this as?
Well, again, it's these different academic disciplines are all siloed.
Yeah.
Right? So
it kind of reminds me of the Jurassic Park scene when they shoot the sensor in the ground and he can see it. And he's like, I'm out of a job now. Like, I don't need to go bushwhacking through a jungle to find this. Maybe to get to it.
Right.
Yeah, but
to
see it and find it.
Bill Romaine's project in 2011. That's about 4 years after I did this. They used a magnetometer to look at what was in the ground. Dr. Jared Burks was an expert in that, and he had a magnetometer, so he did a magnetometer survey. Romaine brought in experts from Indiana University, William Monahan and Ed Herman, who did a electric resistivity survey, which could go look deeper into the ground.
Okay.
They did some limited work with a ground-penetrating radar. And that project, amazing project, Romaine and his team did the most amazing work. Best archaeological work that's been done in Serpent Mound since Putnam, for sure.
Wow.
And they got a permit to do a whole series of core samples throughout the body of the serpent. So there'd only been one modern excavation into the body of Serpent Mound. That was done by Dr. Brad Lepper from the Ohio Historical Society in 1991-ish, I think. And he dug the bend of the serpent that points towards the sunset of the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox. So that center bend that points to the west.
Okay.
They dug a trench through that. It's actually kind of like the lowest part of Serpent Mound. Okay. They relocated a trench that Putnam dug back in the 1880s, and then they believed that they expanded it by a couple of inches on either side. And then they got 3 little bits of carbon, about enough to fill a thimble, that they had carbon dated. That was Lepper's project. And he got back 3 carbon dates. And from that study, they rewrote all of the signage at Serpent Mound, rewrote the historical marker and said, based on the carbon date that Lepper found, it's Fort Ancient. Okay. Now, if you remember the timeline, what was the Fort Ancient
Fort
timeline?
Ancient was pretty recent.
So 1100
right?
AD
to
about 1600 AD. So that's the Fort Ancient era timeline, right? So the 3 carbon dates that Lepper got was 1000 AD, 1000 AD, 800 BC.
And he stuck with the 1000.
Yeah, but that's still 100 years before the earliest Fort Ancient date that anybody else had ever found.
I see.
It just doesn't make any sense, right?
Right.
But that redefined the narrative of Serpent Mound, that study. Okay. Now, what Romaine did was they did a whole series of cores from the top of the mound all the way down to the rock. And they did 17 cores along the entire body of the serpent. And they were able to create a soil profile for the whole body of the serpent, all the different layers. Yep. They could see the uppermost layer that Putnam created when he reconstructed Serpent Mound after his excavations. What Putnam did was he scraped up all the soil around the mound itself and piled it up and amplified the size of Serpent Mound. And he made some design feature changes around the head and the oval.
You can still see where like the horns used to be.
Yes.
The little...
Right, and the LiDAR reveals where those early features
on the side of the head.
He didn't add those back.
Yeah.
No, he didn't.
Right.
But he amplified the size of Serpent Mound. So it turns out, based on the coring data that Romaine got, was that the 2 Fort Ancient dates that Lepper got were from the area of Putnam's backfill.
Well, yeah.
Where he scraped up all the dirt and put it up on top.
You only dig this deep.
Well, no, they dug a full trench, but they just widened it by a couple of inches. But those 2 dates were from the Putnam backfill area. The 800 BC date was way down lower, probably from the core of the mound. Right? So Romaine got a series of carbon dates. The Friends of Serpent Mound actually paid for half of all the carbon dates. A few other organizations tipped in. Ohio Historical Society did not contribute to that carbon dating study. And Romaine's team found that there was sort of a median age. They found 7 different locations of the very bottom layer of where the mound was constructed on. 7 bits of carbon, and these different cores came back with a median age of 321 BC. That's Adena era. That's also the same as the 800 BC date that Lepper threw out. Right. But it's Adena era.
Right.
Now we know that there's a big Adena mound right next to the parking lot because that was excavated by Putnam, and they found people at the very bottom that had Adena artifacts associated with the burial.
Kind of makes sense.
None of those burial mounds have ever been carbon dated. They've never done any genetic studies on any of the people that were removed from those mounds. All the people that were removed from the excavations that Putnam did, they're all sitting in a warehouse at Harvard University at the Peabody Museum. The Friends of Serpent Mound has advocated for about 15 years now for the repatriation of those people.
Yes.
They've never done a single scientific study since Putnam recovered all that stuff on any of the artifacts, on any of the people, on anything.
How and why?
Isn't NAGPRA wasn't that supposed to bring the bones back
if a tribe claims, if a tribe makes a claim.
Right.
But no tribe has made a claim. And there's also kind of this weird loophole in NAGPRA that a lot of the museums like to use. They call the remains culturally unaffiliated, which means they can't trace a descent to a modern tribe to give it back to them.
There's a gap in between their tribe and the ancient
And
people.
So, there's this NAGPRA fight that is going on. For instance, Harvard was called out. There was, in fact, this was a study that Bill Romaine shared with me. The Southeastern Archaeological Conference has a quarterly journal that they put out. And last year was the 30th anniversary of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. And they hired an archaeologist from the Creek tribe down south to write an article about the outcome of NAGPRA after 30 years. And he had a graphic in his article that showed the top 13 worst offenders for compliance with NAGPRA.
Okay.
Harvard was 4th on the list. 3rd on the list was the OHC, was the Ohio Historical Society. They're sitting on over 7,000 sets of human remains. The Harvard had something like 6,000 sets of human remains, many of them from Ohio, from the excavations that Putnam did in Ohio.
This is all very wild.
Right? So the people who are in charge, aren't giving the stuff back. And, the OHC is working with a consortium of 40-some tribes now to try to determine what to do with a lot of these remains. Their current idea is they want to have a giant mass burial somewhere around Columbus somewhere.
Put them all in one spot?
Yeah, there's going to, 7,000 sets of human remains and one big giant burial.
I mean, aren't they cataloged at least to see where they came from, and then they could bring them back to where they are originally from?
That would be in my view.
That's logical to me.
In my view, you got to understand these institutions.
I'm having a tough time.
These these institutions that have archaeological remains, like the OHC, these private corporations.
Is it their treasure? Is it like
their property.
Okay.
Right. The OHC, had all of these artifacts and all of these human remains. They have a monetary value associated with them. They're on their balance sheet, right? And so when a tribe comes to them and says, we want you to repatriate that has to come off the corporate balance sheet.
Wait, explain that to me. What do you mean it has a balance? How does it have a value if they don't use it?
Well, it's part of
artifacts are a collectible
overall
artistic thing, and people buy and sell artifacts all the time.
But can the Ohio History Connection sell them?
Oh,
Can Harvard sell them?
They could if they wanted.
How? They're not theirs.
They own them.
They own them. They're their property.
They're grandfathered in as property.
So they for the last century or so
wild.
They have considered those sets of human remains that they've excavated as their property, right? Well, to me, that's a human rights issue. You can't own other people. I don't care if they're alive or dead. You can't own them as property.
Right. You dug them up out of their place of burial.
Right.
That'd be like going to the Casella Cemetery in 1,000 years and someone digs up your grandma or your grandpa.
100%.
And they're like, we own this.
100%.
Right. When I was a volunteer in the earliest days back in the early 2000s, we asked, well, who's buried in these mountains? I said, nobody's buried in these mountains anymore. What do you mean? Oh, that was all excavated by Harvard. They're all at the Peabody Museum. You're like, what? Why? Why aren't they buried back where they came from? Like, I understand the nature of scientific study.
It's been 140 years.
But yet, it.
Leave it how you found it.
It's been more than a century.
It's crazy.
There's no statute of limitations on doing scientific studies. But hey, it's time to return these people back to where they came from.
But it's out of sight, out of mind. It's in a basement somewhere. It's like, if it's not in the public consciousness.
Yeah, OHC has a huge warehouse. I've been in the warehouse. They had a huge warehouse full of, artifacts and human remains. And it's unbelievable. I mean, they're literally sitting up pile of bones. It's huge.
What do you think the percentage of those artifacts have been studied and cleaned up and looked at?
Again, I don't know what the percentage is. I know that they have tens of thousands of artifacts. What I can tell you about Serpent Mound's artifacts, since Putnam's excavations, and all of those artifacts went to Harvard, there was an excavation, a major excavation that happened at Serpent Mound in the late 1980s. They put in a drinking fountain near the picnic shelter. So they had to run a water line to the drinking fountain.
Yep.
And so they ran the water line from Ohio State Route 73, or down near where the house was, the caretaker house was, across the grass, to the picnic shelter. They did block excavation along that entire line. And the OHC has never written a report about it. I did find that there was an undergraduate student at Ohio University that was assigned as a public service project to go help out the OHC for a semester. She went to the OHC, and the archaeologist at the time, Martha Otto, assigned her to this giant pile of boxes in a room in a corner that was filled full of artifacts that they found during the waterline excavation 10 years after that excavation had happened. And so this girl, young student, spent an entire semester trying to piece it all back together, and in the end wrote a 100-page plus report talking about the 10 to 12,000 artifacts that were found during that excavation. And still to this day, OHC has never written a report, never made any of that material public as to what was found. Now, she included photographs of many of those in her report, which I found in the library at OSU. But this is the kind of stuff that you deal with. They're a corporation.
What's her name? I would love to talk.
Was there any way to go to the Ohio History Connection and say, hey, I know this happened. I know it's real.
So
where is this?
About 5 years ago, 2 retired anthropologists did exactly that. But what they studied was only the pottery shards that were found during that excavation, and they issued an internal private report, which I was able to get. But that is not for public consumption.
Gotcha.
So, that material it's just...
That's a gold mine of data, man.
It's very difficult to get these people to share this information. For instance, I mentioned Dr. Jared Burks. He did a magnetometer survey of Serpent Mound for Romaine's project, Serpent Mound project. And he uncovered one of the most amazing archaeological finds about Serpent Mound that's happened in the past century. He found that on the northeast side of Serpent Mound, just behind the head, there used to be another bend in the Serpent. It's no longer there. And so Romaine and his team did an excavation trench to confirm the magnetometer data, and that was published in their official science, publication.
The bend would have come out and hit that true north line to
yes.
the left?
No,
curved up and then
up onto the right side.
Oh, okay.
If I had my laser, I'd point out, or you got a laser?
I don't know if you can laser point a television.
Do you see on the north? Okay, so when you're looking at Serpent Mound here, you have a north-south line. That's the red line.
Yep.
Just to the right of that, where it intersects the head of the serpent, there's that little round thing.
Yeah.
That's a little mound that used to be attached to Serpent Mound. Just below that, where the neck of the serpent is, that is where the bend was.
I see.
Okay. So that would have been 8 bends? Or how many?
Would have been an additional bend. And so after Burks did that, the Ohio History Connection hired Burks to do a full magnetometer survey of the rest of the interior of the park that is, publicly accessible, outside of the tree line. And they paid him $38,000 for that magnetometer survey. He presented them after several years with the final report, and that is not publicly accessible. So again, if you...
Why?
It's privately owned.
IP.
It's
intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, they're a corporation. It's their private property. They can do whatever they want with it. I've been told that specifically by their CEO. I've been in meetings with their former CEO. He every time it was, well, we own Serpent Mound. It's our private property. We can do whatever we want with it. So, I mean, I've heard that repeatedly from the OAC.
But again, it was established for the people originally. When the protection,
public park forever, right?
Like what
public
we went through
forever.
earlier. And obviously, again, these were ancient people, very super intelligent ancient people. And
that's right.
Somebody built it. It was a communities at one point, and over the years, like you talked about the invasive mound culture. And so maybe people were coming from throughout different times and rebuilding it and adding to it,
right.
And maybe it fell into disrepair.
The archaeologist that did that waterline excavation was fired by the OHC.
So whose is it really?
Why?
I don't know. But before it was fired, during that excavation, there was a Adams County historian that volunteered on the project, and he wrote an article for his local history magazine in Adams County that is the only published record of that waterline excavation. He had some photographs of the excavation, and he interviewed the archaeologist at the time, a guy by the name of Don Beer. And Beer said that when they did that excavation of that waterline, down in the area where there are 3 big depressions in the ground near where the gatehouse is and the parking lot is, for many, many years, the Ohio Historical Society had a sign out there that called those depressions borrow pits. Well, that meant that they believed that those depressions were made from the dirt that was borrowed from that area to build Serpent Mound and the other mounds.
Okay.
Okay, that's actually not the case, but that's what they believed at the time, and they had that sign up there. Well, when they ran the water line, they went in between where those pits are, those depressions are, and the parking lot, and that's where Don Beer said they found the highest concentration of artifacts. And he was super excited at the time because, for the most part, they were intrusive burial mound culture artifacts. And there's never been an intrusive burial mound culture site outside of what's being found in burial mounds. And so he believed that this was a super important thing for archaeology because they could learn more about the intrusive burial mound culture. Well, now nobody knows anything about that because the only evidence that we have for any of that comes from this interview before the guy got fired, and they never wrote the report. So, it's like trying to find these bits and pieces to try to understand what the true story of Serpent Mound is. It's very challenging.
It's just really sad.
How do you not just go crazy, Jeff? How do you not just come out?
It's
I'd
difficult.
say that rabbit hole just keeps going.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to forward through this, but
Sure.
I think this was the one that just had animations talking about different nomenclature.
Yeah.
No, this is the actual astronomical alignment.
Did
So
I hit way too far?
no, that's okay.
Okay.
These yellow lines that you see that now are animated across the screen represent all of the solar alignments that are incorporated into the design of Serpent Mound. Okay, so essentially the way to think about it is you have the body of the serpent where all the bends are in the center point of the serpent, some that point towards the east and some that point towards the west. Each one of those bends points to the place on the horizon where the sun rises during key moments of the sun's cycle throughout the year. The spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumn equinox, the winter solstice. And so all of the sunrise alignments and all of the sunset alignments are incorporated into the shape of Serpent Mound itself. And there's actually some duplicates. So for instance, there are 2 summer solstice sunset alignments. There are 2 winter solstice sunset alignments. So it's reinforced within the design. And so Serpent Mound, as I said on Ancient Apocalypse, is one of the most amazing archaeoastronomy sites in North America because it incorporates all of these solar alignments, and it also incorporates all the lunar alignments, the key lunar alignments, which I think if you go forward here one step, you'll see the blue lines come up. All of the blue lines represent the lunar alignments, and it incorporates solar and lunar alignments and possibly planetary alignments into one unified design. And it's not like a circle of rocks or a circle of posts. It's a recognizable sculpture.
Yeah.
It's a sheer work of genius, right? You have to understand that this is like ideas condensating on the ground, right? Coming through people that made these, right? These are ideas from people's heads that now incorporate information from their culture and their cultural time frame that were incorporated into this structure.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
It's just sheer astonishing.
Speaks volumes, right?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Right.
And how were they able to, I mean, just of what we know about astronomy, it's like Copernicus and, during the Renaissance, a lot of these things were starting to just come. But here we have in Ohio, there's stuff built into the Serpent Mound, like
dates back to Aristotle
and geometry,
right?
geometric principles and mathematics.
So you're talking
that
about
just
going back
blow
into
your
BC
mind.
times.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what you're seeing on the screen here is I've, over the past several years, done a project to map out from an aerial drone these alignments because it's become very difficult to do that on the ground with all of the trees and the limited access now that they have imposed on the site. So you can see here, if you put up the animation, I think you'll see an arrow that will point. So this is pointing from that central bend to the horizon for the vernal equinox. It's the same for the autumnal equinox. There's just more leaves on the trees in the autumn. But you can go forward and you'll be able to see. This is a time lapse that I took back in 2015 in that bend of the Serpent, watching the sunrise for the vernal equinox.
There we go.
This video is also on YouTube. You can go out there, just do Serpent Mound time lapse in your search, and you'll find several of these time lapses of the sunrise coming up in the center of the bend.
Damn, that's cool.
Okay. This comes up right after the people there. I had to shoo somebody out that walked in there.
Wow.
So there it is. So,
excuse me.
Crazily enough, you just watched this, right? It's there. It happened.
Right.
Okay. Brad Lepper and Chief Ben Barnes of the Shawnee wrote an article last year saying that there are no alignments at Serpent Mound. There are none.
But we just
What are these coincidences?
I don't understand.
So,
we just saw.
Again, so you can believe your lying eyes, or you can listen to the guy that writes the narrative for Serpent Mound. He says there are none. So
I think that's an important distinction you made earlier, though, and you've kind of drilled it down pretty hard about, we look at it as the Ohio History Connection, the Ohio Historical Society. It's a company.
yeah.
How do we get all these people together in the same room to talk about these?
I don't think that's ever going to happen.
I've been in the same room with these people.
I want to hold a debate almost to, it's like, let's bring these images up. Let's talk about, let's discuss it. And maybe you learn something new.
So
maybe
here's your sunset for the vernal equinox. You can put up the animation there, and you can just move through these. Mm-hmm. This is each one of the solar alignments. Here you got a little bit of fog there.
Jesus.
This is the summer solstice.
Gorgeous.
That is beautiful.
What a great image, Jeff.
And
Wow.
here's this is very similar to the shot that Graham included in America Before.
Yep.
This is my drone shot of the same alignment, but it's almost it's the same alignment, summer solstice.
But it's almost like not giving them credit.
Samantha Hancock did a great job shooting her shot. I have a comparable one there. Then you have the autumnal equinox sunrise here. It's the same as the vernal equinox.
But aren't we minimizing how advanced this is by saying that?
Yeah,
we're really saying, well, maybe they're not that in tune. Maybe this site isn't that incredible. But I mean,
it's discounting the genius of the people that actually built.
That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
But at Newark, they admit, like, the Great Octagon, is the 18.6 year lunar calendar. I went to the museum, and they have this new Hopewell exhibit, and it goes through on the wall, and it's this whole display of. It's like, well, that has a ton of astronomical alignments. Why wouldn't this?
Well, part of it has to do, I think, with archaeological ego. The guys that did the first, the people that did the first reporting of an astronomical alignment at Serpent Mound were two people from Florida, Clark Hardiman Jr. and his wife Marjorie. And they identified the summer solstice sunset alignment through the head and through the oval to the horizon. And the issue that archaeologists have had ever since they did that is, well, first of all, they're not archaeologists.
So you're not in the club?
Not in the club.
Okay.
They were dowsers.
Dowel
I've
rods.
heard this story.
Oh my gosh! If
that's like woo woo to some people, but dowsing's been around forever. That's when my grandpa and them used to find water.
Very unscientific, but nevertheless, they were the first ones to document it. And ever since, it's been like, oh my God, archaeological community says, no, we can't touch that because
they didn't say it first, or?
Yeah. So then the next group that did any solar alignment work were two non-archaeologists, Fletcher and Cameron, and they identified the sunrises for the summer solstice and the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice. They only did the sunrise. They didn't do the sunsets. I asked Cameron one time why he didn't do the sunsets. He says, well, there are too many leaves on the trees, so they didn't do it. and I said, well, why don't you just go in the springtime when there are no leaves on the trees? He said, well, we didn't think of that. So
Fair enough.
we've identified them since, both in calculating them and in sitting on the ground, and like you've seen these shots, right?
Yeah.
So, but Cameron and Fletcher were the two people, along with Lepper, that did the 1991 excavation, through the trench.
Okay.
And so, if you go to Serpent Mound, they have one sign that's just this weird kind of oblique angle drawing of Serpent Mound that shows only the 3 astronomical alignments from Cameron and Fletcher. That's it. No other ones. Right. So
they admit to parts.
Yeah,
but not.
But now Lepper says there aren't. So it's hard to say. It changes all the time. They definitely don't like to acknowledge any of Romaine's work, Romaine's lunar alignment work. And Romaine did a lot of calculations of all of the other alignments. In fact, Romaine did the work to calculate, to confirm my observations of the most recent alignment that was found. In 2015, I discovered that when you get to the last bend of the serpent, if you extend that last bend through the center point of the spiral tail to the horizon, that's the alignment for the winter solstice. It's like a symmetrical match of the one for the summer solstice, which is through the head.
Yeah.
The other one goes through the tail.
Is that this one or is that the next one?
That's the sunrise.
Okay.
If you go to the next one, that's the sunset.
Okay.
And there's your sunset. So right through the center of the tail. And
Whoa.
if you go out to YouTube,
Yep.
you can see I did a time lapse video
yin
of the
and the
sunset
yang.
there.
Yeah.
All right. So Romaine did the actual mathematical calculations to confirm this, and published that material. And so they just don't acknowledge it. They don't want to acknowledge it because in almost all the circumstances, non-archaeologists were making these observations. Like, again, I would consider myself to be more of an astronomer than an archaeologist. But my interest has always been in this prehistoric astronomy, what they call archaeoastronomy.
Yeah.
So,
do you think it's interesting that they put the solstices on the head and tail for the winter and summer? And is there any cyclical
Longest day of
movement
the
through
year, shortest day of the year?
yeah,
I meant
it
we're
makes
going
you
through winter to get to the summer, and the head of the summer is.
It forces you to consider cultural impacts because of the way that the design is laid out, right? There's a lot of cultural implications about this that relates to people's usage through the calendar year, right? And through the cycle of the moon, which takes 18.6 years to complete that cycle.
Yeah.
You're talking about generations of observations.
Right.
And so you were earlier asking, well, how did they figure that out? How did they... Well, for many years, I tried to understand what this was. And I don't know if you noticed it, but on that overhead LiDAR view, it had all the astronomical alignments. I had this little dotted purple circle
off to the left.
And that's where many of the astronomical alignments kind of converge to a central point.
Yeah.
Well, that point is actually off the cliff.
Right.
And so if you were going to stand in one place to make those observations, you can't do it because it's off the cliff. Either that or they built a tower there off the cliff to stand there to figure that out, right?
I see what you're saying.
And so there's some philosophical underpinnings of considering, well, what does that mean? Why is that the case, right? Well, a few years ago, I was granted special researcher access to Harvard's archives about Serpent Mound. And most of that stuff is not digitized. So I was ordering stuff directly from their catalog of material that has never really been seen before. I worked with them for about, 6 weeks to a month on finding a way to digitize this gigantic oversized map that Putnam had made. Putnam, I found there are 2 unpublished maps of Serpent Mound that Putnam did for the entirety of the park. Putnam had a bit of a background in surveying. At one point, before he became the curator of the Peabody Museum, he was the assistant on the Kentucky Geological Survey. And how he got his job as the curator of Harvard's Peabody Museum is because he was the nephew of Uncle George Peabody, who donated all the money to make the Peabody Museum at Harvard and one at Yale. That was at the request of one of Putnam's cousins, a kind of a geologist from Yale University by the name of Nathaniel Marsh, O.C. Marsh. He was digging at the Newark earthworks, and digging up a mound in Newark, and he was coming up with all these artifacts, and he said, you know what, we really need to figure out some way to preserve these, build some kind of museum to house this stuff. And so he wrote to his Uncle George Peabody, a wealthy industrialist in London, and said, hey, what do you think of this idea? And so George Peabody donated $100,000 to Yale for the Natural History Museum at Yale, and $100,000 to Harvard to establish the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology.
Okay.
They hired a curator there, a guy by the name of Jeffery Wyman, who was there for a number of years, and then Wyman dropped dead unexpectedly. So they looked around for somebody to replace Wyman, and they picked up Putnam out of the backwoods of Kentucky and dropped him in to be the curator of the Peabody Museum at Harvard.
That's wild.
So, you know, a little nepotism going on there. That's another story they don't like to tell you about.
Yeah.
Because Putnam is held up as the father of American archaeology in many cases. In fact, you go to Harvard Peabody Museum, that's exactly how they describe him. So, in any event, that location, because it's off of the edge of the cliff, leads you to wonder about, well, where did they stand to be able to make the observations, right? And yeah, here's the one with all the blue lines. Those are all the lunar alignments. So northernmost moonrise, midpoint moonrise, southernmost moonrise. That takes 18.6 years to complete that cycle, right? That's the same kind of cycle that they laud at Newark, right? At the Octagon.
At the golf
There's
course.
that central avenue, and it highlights one of these astronomical alignments.
And there's your circle that's converging.
Yeah, this is throwing me off because I've never considered it, of how they had the perspective to draw the lines.
That's
to
what I
figure
mean.
out.
Right.
Like,
I've
how do
never
you know
So
where
considered
this
to
is the thing
stand?
that came
How
up
do
in
you-
Ancient Aliens, right? The Ancient Aliens solution is, well,
From
gosh, it
above,
must be
from
UFOs
the
from above,
sky,
right?
yeah.
That they figured it out. Well, the thing is that the hill to the north
know
of
if I'd
Serpent
go that
Mound
far with it.
is elevated by about 50 to 80 feet. And Putnam actually went up there and took pictures looking down at Serpent Mound. So you do get an elevated view from the hill to the north, which is on
Right.
private property. And it's all forested now, so you can't really have that view. But when Putnam was there, remember, all the trees were down, so they were able to take pictures from up there.
Right.
So it is much more elevated. So it's not really necessary. You don't have to be flying in a UFO to look at Serpent Mound to figure it out.
Right.
Okay. But if you go forward another slide, I think, just keep going forward. Yeah, you can skip this because we've been talking about that stuff.
I don't know if some of these slides are doubled up.
Oh,
or
maybe
what's
that was
going
doubled
There we
up.
go.
on. Okay.
Maybe we can come back to this, but
Okay.
I want to make a specific point. It just forward through this a little
Copy
bit.
that.
We can come back to it. Skip this, and I'll come back to it.
God, that's so cool.
That's a kind of a wider view. So this is Putnam's map. All right. And you can see the folds and the creases. There's kind of a couple holes in there where it was folded up. So Putnam
Yeah.
made two maps.
Might want to go full screen on this for a sec, Kyle.
These two maps that Putnam made. One he made in 1886 when Harvard acquired the property. And it was basically to figure out where the property lines are. And so you look at the map, you can see the property boundaries of the park. That's all measured out exactly the way it is today. All right?
Okay.
And then he did 4 summers of excavations. And then he made this map. And this map shows all of the results of the excavations. And this map was never published before. And this is the academia paper that you said that I had written. I wrote a paper talking about finding these 2 unpublished maps in the archives about Serpent Mound and discussing one of the finds that I made on this map, which had not been previously reported. Putnam only wrote, he did 4 summers of excavations, and in year 3, he wrote an article 12 pages long, including all the photographs that were included to illustrate it. That was published in Century Magazine in 1890. And he wrote that the prior year, and it took a year before that was published. And so there's a whole nother year excavations after the article had already been written, but had not yet been published. And so just 12 little pages is all he wrote about all of the stuff that they found at Serpent Mound. So I've gone back into Harvard's archives, and I've looked at every single artifact that they found. I've looked at all the catalog informations about all the people who were buried, where they were buried from. I've looked at all of this paper documentation, all the documentation from the ladies of Boston to the trustees of the Peabody Museum about how they say. I've looked at all of it. And you have to go back to that primary source to really begin to understand, well, what is it that they were finding? Where did they find it? So I put together like this 4 to 5 hour long presentation about all of the stuff that Putnam found, the mysterious Putnam excavations, because he barely talked about any of it.
So all of that is still at the Peabody?
Yes.
At Harvard?
Correct. Yeah. And
do
so
they display these things?
Or is they have a very few, probably somewhere between 5 and 10 small artifacts on display in a museum.
Okay.
Most of it is totally not on display. So on this map, south of Serpent Mound, I think if you go one more forward here, this shows a section on the map. There's a big white area there where it's now a piece missing, where it was all folded up. And just to one side of that, you'll see that there's a circle in the center. That little circle, that Putnam colored green, is the small conical mound that exists today next to the picnic shelter at Serpent Mound. Okay? But if you notice, that circle is at the center of this dotted line circle. In fact, it's a double dotted line circle that goes around.
Yeah.
Okay? And if you go on the animation, I think I got some animation there to show that. Well, that little box that I put up there is the notation about what those dots are. It says the black dots are post holes.
So a henge?
A wood henge. Okay? So it was my hypothesis that that double dotted line was a wood henge that served as the location for where they figured out all of the astronomical alignments at Serpent Mound.
Oh,
and then they took that knowledge, transferred it 200 feet to the north.
This is the calculator.
And constructed the sculpture based on the knowledge from the wood henge here. Okay. Now, if you were to see, that's right at the center point of it. Okay. So if you go through this animation here to the next slide. These are just some notations on that. So this is where it would look like today.
There's
so you can
the
see
parking lot.
You can see how big that circle was. It's a little over 300 feet in diameter, based on exactly mapping Putnam's map to the property boundaries, which are not unchanged to this day. Right? You can figure out essentially where that location was.
Right.
Okay, and so you can see where that is now. That whole area, where the parking lot is and the picnic shelter is and the museum is, over the course of the last 100 years, there have been about 27 different buildings that used to exist in that area that were there and then removed, were there and then removed. So tracking that over time through historical photographs, there's somewhere close to almost 30 buildings that had been in that area. That area has been so disturbed, so ridiculously disturbed. And so it's hard to determine what may or may not be there. In any event, in Don Beer's waterline excavation, going across that area, remember the drinking fountain used to be near the picnic shelter. His waterline excavation crossed the area where that wood henge possibly would have been. Again, we have no report, but in the report that was done by the Adams County historian Stephen Kelly, he included photographs which showed that where the waterline excavation crossed that area, there was a circle of posts, kind of a circular ring of posts that were found. Okay. Now, I talked to one of the guys that worked on the excavation. He's in his 70s, a guy by the name of Andy Davenport, who worked at the park during that period of time. He actually worked at the park going all the way back to the early 1970s. And when they did this excavation, he said not only did, when they found that, Don Beer got really excited about it, and he said that they did a secondary excavation away from the main excavation to the west of the picnic shelter. Now you see that ring goes around the picnic shelter, right? To the west. And he said that they did about somewhere between 12 and 20 feet long trench, and they found more post holes. Okay. Now, we don't have a picture of it. We don't have a written report of it. We only have what one of the guys that worked on it said, and we have the picture in the report from the Adams County historian that confirms that maybe those post holes were there. Okay. Now, Dr. Jared Burks did a big giant magnetometer survey of this area. He didn't find anything. So we don't have real good confirmation of it, but it's my contention, based on Putnam's documentation from his original excavations, that exists there.
Right.
Now, an alternative explanation for that was, well, during the Fort Ancient era, those people used to build kind of a picket wall around their villages. And so an alternative explanation is possibly, well, maybe this is a Fort Ancient wall construction. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't
kind of like you see at
appear...
Cahokia, where they built those massive, big log walls around the whole place, which I think they killed off all the trees. That used to be a hypothesis. I don't think that's legit anymore.
So, but I contend that it's more likely that it's a wood henge, because other wood henges have been found in Ohio, as well as the ones at Cahokia.
Yeah.
Right. So the first wood henge that was found in Ohio was found at a place called the Stubbs Earthworks. It's about 5 miles south of Fort Ancient.
Okay.
There was the property was sold to the local school district, and they wanted to build a high school there. And so they started to, prepare the site. They had a bulldozer out there bulldozing the area where I think they were going to put the football field. And the guy in the bulldozer noticed that as he ran across the ground, there was this weird sort of arc of little circles in the ground. And so they called in an archaeologist team from Cincinnati Museum Center, and they did an emergency excavation, and they found this entirety of a wood henge. Okay, that was the first one that was found. That was in the 90s. Then...
Wasn't found until the 90s?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then in the early 2000s, a female archaeologist at the National Park Service, Jennifer Pedersen Weinberger, did a magnetometer survey at the Hopewell Earthworks, and she discovered a wood henge at the Hopewell Earthworks. And over the past 15 years or so, they have slowly confirmed that through archaeological excavation. Dr. Brett Ruby, National Park Service, has been in charge of those excavations. Okay. Dr. Brett Ruby also, during those excavations, they wanted to do a magnetometer survey of the whole site. So at first they got Dr. Jared Burks from Ohio Valley Archaeology to start doing that work, and he started at one end of it, and months of work, and he's got about 20% of the way across, and it's taken him forever. Well, Ruby had gone to a conference, an archaeological conference, in which he saw the results of kind of advanced magnetometry research that was being done by the German Archaeological Institute. They basically did all of the magnetometer research that was done at Stonehenge and the whole plain around Stonehenge.
I was just going to say, this is similar to what they've recently discovered. Stone and I and Chris went to Stonehenge, and just then they were just talking about the Woodhenge and
out near Stonehenge.
How there's several other henges that are all basically one big site of the major site. But so it's so wild. You see these Stonehenges in Europe, and here they are in Ohio.
Yeah, so the National Park Service brought in the German Archaeological Institute's team, and they had a 13 magnetometer array, and they did Hopewell site Mound, Hopeton site. They did a bunch of the National Park Service units of Hopewell Culture National Park, and they found tons and tons of stuff. The archaeologists at National Park Service will be excavating that stuff for the next century and a half.
Whoa.
There's so much stuff. They found like dozens of enclosures that nobody knew about before. So that's the power of that. But the limitation of magnetometry is that it only detects alterations that are in the soil that gives it that magnetically induced bit. So like ditches are a big thing, because once you dig a ditch, then it sort of slowly gets filled in over time. That fill dirt is magnetically different than the surrounding area, and so that shows up right away on a magnetometer. It's why when Burks did his magnetometer survey of Serpent Mound, their intention was to figure out, well, where did Putnam trench through it, right? Figure out where all the trenches were. But the problem was that Putnam layered a whole gigantic layer of soil on top of Serpent Mound, and so Serpent Mound was essentially opaque. Serpent Mound showed up like a big giant black line in the magnetometer survey because it was all disturbed earth, right? And so in any event, what I did here was I transposed the size of the circle from around where the picnic shelter is to the convergence point of Serpent Mound, and lo and behold, the curvature of Serpent Mound fits exactly to the curvature of that dotted line circle.
That is very interesting.
Like the Woodhenge part of it, right? And so I think that the Woodhenge idea, this hypothesis, has some merit because it seems to give you the explanation for the astronomical alignments. Like, well, because they did the observations over here,
right, because it was
and then they moved it over there
off the cliff,
but they based it on the same size of the circle, right?
Yeah, like if they were actually, like you said, standing, that's deep down in a cliff. And for those just going to be listening, it's the
center point is off the cliff pretty significantly.
Yeah, so you would be down below where that cave is almost.
Right. So I don't know if you want to go back a couple slides and I could talk a little bit about that LiDAR stuff.
This one?
Yeah, go back before these maps of Putnam. The LiDAR findings, we can stay just right on this slide. If you want to hit the animation. What you see here is Serpent Mound is sort of on the left side, right? And then you notice I put this little box up. This is one of the things that we don't really know much about, is we know exactly you can see where the parking lot is and where the asphalt pathways are in this LiDAR image, but this sort of rectangle feature is on a plateau to the southeast of the parking lot. And so it's an anomaly. We don't really know what made that. Is that a prehistoric feature? Well, no one's really dug into that to confirm whether it is or it isn't.
Doesn't look natural.
Right. Another feature is if you look just to the east of Serpent Mound, on this map, it would be kind of above where Serpent Mound is. You'll notice that there's kind of a weird oval feature. Yeah. That stuck out to me like a sore thumb when I first saw the LiDAR, because I'm like, what the heck is that? No one's ever written about that. I mean, I read everything that any archaeologist had written about Serpent Mound, and nobody ever reported that feature. I went out there. It's only like 50 feet from the mound on the east side. It's out in the woods.
Yeah.
And it's just inside the tree line, and it's a pit feature about 40 feet long and about 25 feet wide and about 12 feet deep.
Wow.
You might think that might be something that somebody would want to study, but nobody has ever reported on it. And so whether that's a modern thing or a prehistoric thing, we don't really know. No archaeologist at this point was willing to touch it. So, we just don't know what that is. Now, the Friends of Serpent Mound spent some time cleaning out what was the material that was in there. So we cleared it out, and it does hold water during certain seasons of the year. So it's unclear whether that was a man-made pool of some kind. The Hopewell were known to do things like that. It could be a modern construction. None of the early aerial photographs really show that area in good detail. Right. So we don't really know, because they're all focused on the serpent. They're not focused away from the serpent.
And none of this is in any of Putnam's drawings.
No.
Because
Yeah,
that all would
none
have
of
been
the
cleared
early
too, right?
none of the early drawings, besides Putnam's, don't show this either. So it's really a puzzle what this is. And so that's what
strange.
LiDAR picks up. Now, you may notice that there's a like kind of another sort of square thing up in the upper right corner.
Right.
Yeah.
We know what that is. That is a pond that was constructed by the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA, the Works Project Administration, back in the 1930s. There was a work camp that was set up there. And most of what you see in the park today, the landscape of how the park was created, including the parking lot, the restrooms, the museum, the caretaker house, the maintenance building, the rock walls that are there, the pathways that go around Serpent Mound, there are drains around the mound, stuff. All of that, including the overlook that, out at the head of the Serpent, all of that was created, federal taxpayer money, during the WPA and the CCC era, right?
Okay.
And so that is an era of time that changed the land use of Serpent Mound significantly, and it's not very well documented.
Okay.
Right. And that's
Yeah.
something that my wife and I have been working on recently, is to try to document all of that material, because it's important to understand what the land use changes are,
Yeah.
so you can figure out what these things are, what these
Right,
features are
right.
that we now have questions about. We don't really
Right.
know. Right.
I mean,
Amazing
that's crazy
stuff.
to think that that's just sitting off in the woods next to it.
Right.
It's
So
incredible
you
stuff.
can also see the 3 depressions on here. I think if you go in the animation, I point them out, or maybe not. But
Yeah, I think that was.
but you can see those on there. Now, those depressions, I kind of don't call them borrow pits like the OHC used to call them any longer, because of William Romaine's Serpent Mound project. Romaine did not believe that those were borrow pits. He had a hypothesis that those were actually sinkholes. And so,
from the caves or something.
partnering with the people from Indiana University, they ran an electric resistivity survey line over those areas. Essentially, it's an electrical wire. You put a post in the ground at one end, and then you put posts in wherever the electrical line goes, and then it shoots that electricity down in the ground, and the data comes back into the sensor, and you can tell what constitutes the layers of soil in the ground, about maybe down to about 30 feet deep. It's a little bit better than ground penetrating radar.
Okay.
But there's some interpretation that needs to happen when you look at that stuff. But they did confirm that those are sinkholes. Now, here's the important part about this. And this is something that I had to tell Romaine. In the late 1990s, or maybe in the mid 1990s, one of those sinkholes opened up, and there was a hole in the middle of it. Now, based on what Don Beer had said about the highest concentration of artifacts was along the edge between those depressions and the parking lot, if they had done a report, and if people knew that that was the case, they might have done something different than what they did. They did not investigate that archaeologically. What the Ohio History Connection did instead was they dumped 14 dump truck loads worth of gravel down into it. Okay.
Good grief.
So if there was a cavern,
It's gone.
that is now largely unrecoverable without an enormous
So
amount
there
of
could
work.
it could be some hidden chamber or
Well, Romaine
man-made chamber,
did
potentially.
find that the gravel only went into kind of 2 of the depressions. One of the depressions seems to be still intact. It's about 30 feet long and at least 15 feet high. So it's a pretty big cavern down there, but doing archaeology to get down into it might be pretty challenging. But nevertheless, that's another mysterious thing about Serpent Mound
Right.
that could have been explained, and instead the corporation chose another thing because they felt that there was liability there. It was dangerous
Yeah,
for the
somebody's gonna
public.
get hurt, which
So they
I get-
originally
I
put a
get it.
fence up around it, and then they said, okay, we got to take the fence out, and then they just filled it in with gravel.
It just seems like a purposeful botch job
Well,
from start to finish.
I mean, but again, you have bureaucrats, like
Yeah.
people making
And
decisions.
years
that
of administration that have done bad things at Serpent Mound.
it's
Right?
crazy.
I mean, just to give you one more example. Well, maybe I'll tell the story when we get to a closer picture. But we'll go ahead. Go ahead.
keep moving.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, the amount of information that you have collected
Dude, you go down
over these years.
holes.
I mean,
there's the impact.
Okay,
crater.
so here's the LiDAR map
fantastic.
that I put together showing the entirety of the crater. So this is the Serpent Mound Crypto Explosive Area Natural National Landmark. And I put a little animation there. That little arrow points to where Serpent Mound is in relation to the crater. And then this is a color elevation version of that, so you can see where the Brush Creek Valley goes and where the central uplift is and where the crater rims are. And I think if you go forward one more, I think I have an animation here showing where, I guess not, but I had an animation in here that showed where all the gravitational anomalies are and where the magnetic anomalies are. Serpent Mound actually sits in between two electromagnetic field highs, according to what was mapped by the geologists. So,
Okay. I think our
but
slide deck's
but you
getting
can
a
see
little
that this
bigger.
map that was created, is not perfectly square, rectangular. That there's little bits of data
Right.
missing out of there. That's because each tiny little square here is like the 83,000 data points of the Serpent Mound little thing. And remember, I did that giant map of Serpent Mound with LiDAR. So this is like that times 50. This map took me about 2 weeks of processing time on my computer to process this data originally.
Surrender time.
Just render time, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Now, it's a little faster today to be able to do that, but
Yeah,
back when I did this
processors.
in 2011, it was pretty challenging.
Yeah.
Like it would be challenging to like take a couple of these squares and put them together, but I did this for like 25 squares, and it was like, can you really do it? And, so,
This is cool.
yeah.
It's a very neat image.
Okay, so this is a aerial photo map that I did of Serpent Mound a few years ago with my LiDAR, or with my drone, I'm sorry. This is made up of 802 high-resolution photographs that were stitched together using some software that created the most detailed, comprehensive photomosaic map of Serpent Mound. And from this data, you can do a lot of things. Now, this is a commercial drone. You guys, I think, have the same model drone.
Yep.
It's a Mavic Pro 2. And so just by using some different software, you can get it to do some fun scientific things. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to discern that in this picture, but when I was taking these photos in the springtime, because there's no leaves on the trees, I noticed that in the bend of the serpent that points to the summer solstice sunset, which is the bend if you're starting from the tail, it's the next one, the first one that bends towards the west. Okay? So it's the first bend to the west. There is a circle patch there in the grass.
I see it.
Okay. Now, I've
see
done a
it?
lot of aerial photography over
Yeah,
the years.
Right below that yellow tree.
No, that's the center one. You got to go down to the one below that. There is a circle there in the center one.
Oh, the darker one.
Yeah, it's a dark circle there. And
Okay, right by the path.
I've done aerial photography in prior years in which I was able to, like I mentioned before, I took an aerial photograph of the junction group. That was in a farm field, and what showed up was a discoloration in the crops based on the differentiation of the soil from the earthwork below. This is something similar to that. And so this is another archaeological feature we know nothing about. But it's about 100 feet in diameter. It's not small,
Right.
all right? Based on this picture, it looks like it's really tiny. But when you get there on the ground, that's a pretty sizable circular feature.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, bigger than this room that we're in,
Yeah.
certainly, right?
Yeah.
So it's a pretty big structure, relatively speaking. And so I want to go ahead and flip to the next picture. So what your drone
there it
can
is.
do is you can separate out the wavelengths of light, same drone imagery, but instead of looking at it in the visible part of the spectrum, you can create a spectral image. And that's what we're looking at here. And that shows up, there's actually 3 blue circles. In the 3 bends that point to the west, there are 3 of these circles. And again, this is coming from the spectral image. So those features are there in the landscape, and it's pulling them up as reflecting differently than the surrounding area.
Right.
Okay. Go to the next slide, and this is a thermal image. All right. So you can look at the thermal imagery on your drone.
See,
and
I thought I was seeing other circles though.
Yep. Again, there are 3 circles there.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is another puzzle. We don't really know what these features are. Jared Burks' magnetometer did not pick these up. Okay. So we have a different kind of archaeological feature than what a magnetometer tendency is to pull up in its data. So this is another archaeological feature we do not know anything about. Lots of mysteries at Serpent Mound.
Theories?
Well, I don't really have one that I could
Gotcha.
put forward right at this point.
Yeah.
I mean that I'm willing to share.
Gotcha.
Not
Gotcha.
enough data
No problem.
to have a.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
open
just very
hypothesis,
interesting,
yeah.
the
Okay.
location of
Another thing that you can use with this imagery is you can create what's known as a digital elevation model from that digital mosaic, and you take the imagery away, and this is what's underlying it. It's created by thousands and thousands of tiny little triangles, essentially, to create a 3-dimensional model of what you're seeing. And if you notice that in the center of the oval, you'll see a circle there, okay? Well, that circle corresponds to, I put a little historical photo in there of, there used to be a circular pile of stones in the center of the oval at Serpent Mound, or just offset from the center. That pile of stones was identified by Squire and Davis, and it was identified by Putnam when he was there, and it survived the reconstruction. This is a post-reconstruction photo that Putnam took. I colorized it using a colorizing algorithm.
Oh, wow.
And this is because this was on a black and white glass plate.
Yeah.
I found this, and I used a publicly accessible colorization algorithm, and you can see that pile of stones was still there, a couple feet high, a couple feet in diameter. And here's why I'll tell you the story. So everybody asks, well, what happened to that? It's not there today. Right? What happened to the circle of stones? Well, the circle of stones was there until the mid-1980s. You think, well, why isn't it there today? It was there in the 1980s. Why is it not there today? Well, because the people at the Ohio Historical Society got tired of cutting the grass around it, so they picked up the stones, walked it over to the edge, and threw the stones over the side of the cliff.
Whoa. That's desecration of an ancient site.
Probably the most sacred place at the sacred place,
right?
And they just dismantled it and threw it over both sides of the cliff.
I mean, as someone that
in the 2000s when I was volunteering there,
places that makes my stomach just turn.
We heard this story, and I convinced the site manager at the time, let's go on a hunt. I believed that if they were that lazy to throw the stones over the cliff, well, they probably just picked them up and walked to the closest point of the cliff on both sides, and we found all those stones. Okay, and so we notified the OHC and told them that that where the stones were located. They were all within. We used an industrial leaf blower and blew down the vegetation down the sides of the cliff, and all the stones were within about a 10-foot wide kind of array right down the cliffside.
Okay.
Right? So the question has been, and I've been in a bunch of these meetings around, how to manage Serpent Mound, been in management plan meetings about it. What do they do about it? And the question is, well, if they replace the stones back to where they came from, how long do you think they're going to last before people just walk away with them
pretty quick,
as souvenirs?
I would think.
That's a good point.
So they don't want to do that.
I can
Do they
respect that.
replace it with a fake altar?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do that. So they're in this quandary of, well, what do we do? We're not going to do anything about it. But it just becomes a chapter in what is the land use history since,
We're
the site was
bits
discovered.
and pieces as we go.
Bits and pieces going away. That little tip mound that's up there closer to the edge of the cliff on the other side of the oval from where the head is, that's a remnant of the outer oval that used to exist. If you go back and you look at all the early drawings of Serpent Mound, I think I included that in my folder of stuff, but you can see all the earliest drawings of Serpent Mound show that there was an outer oval outside of the current oval. And after Putnam's reconstruction, that outer oval vanished, except for that little tip mound up there is like the last little remnant bit of it. And so this is where I've kind of parted a little bit with Graham and his interpretation in Ancient Apocalypse. Graham is using like the alignment from the head of the serpent through that tip mound off to the horizon to determine that that is an astronomical alignment that dates back to before the Younger Dryas. But that, I don't believe, is the case. I think that's just a remnant feature. It's offset from the center point of the oval and the head. And what you have to do is you have to draw a line from the back of the notch of the head through that center altar straight to the horizon. And that is offset from what Graham talked about in Ancient Apocalypse.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, and that is the alignment that we see the summer solstice sunset come down on still to this day. So that was likely constructed in, 321 BC or roughly thereabouts. And, that's the alignment that's for the summer solstice. Graham's, conjecture is, no, I think it's this other alignment over here. And I'm not sure I really buy that.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
I mean, it's a hypothesis,
right?
Yep.
It's hard to find additional proof to prove it one way or the other.
Right.
And I'm sure when you brought it, if you brought it up to him, that
he's seen all these presentations. He's gone through I've gone through all this material with him.
Dude, this is so crazy.
So here's another little bit about that center oval. So I've talked about using commercially available drones to do this, sort of thermal imagery and spectral imagery and mapping with LiDAR and all this kind of stuff. This is LiDAR now today. So when I did those early LiDAR maps, that was in 2007.
Right.
LiDAR technology is advanced.
Major. To
the point where I remember Stanford University about maybe 10 years ago, when you're an archaeologist and you do like a block trench excavation, you have to do a lot of drawings of every layer of soil that you go through. And the students at Stanford that were getting trained in this archaeological method were like, this is such a waste of time. And they said somebody got their Xbox Kinect, rewrote some software. That Xbox Kinect technology is LiDAR. It scans the entire room and it monitors your movements during you playing that game. And so they rewrote the software and they just scanned the trench. And they got the depth and the imagery of it, and they scanned the trench on every layer, and they just, why do we got to go do this the old way? We're just going to use this new technology. Well, the company that built that Xbox Kinect was bought by Apple. And they have miniaturized that and now put that in your iPhone. So if you buy an iPhone Pro from 12, 13, 14, it has LiDAR built into it. So I've got my, phone here. So there's a little tiny circle sensor on your phone, right? That is your LiDAR sensor. And it was put on the iPhone to make your phone focus better in low light conditions. So it sends the LiDAR out, figures out where everything is, and then focuses to that distance so that you get good pictures in low light conditions.
That's cinema mode.
But smart people have rewritten software and apps that allow you to just use the LiDAR only.
As is, yeah.
As is. And so what I did was I used some of that software and I took a selfie stick and I walked around the oval and I scanned the oval with my iPhone, and lo and behold, on the left is the visible light version. On the right is, when you look at it, just the LiDAR data, and you can see the remnant of that stone altar, that stone circle in the oval.
Wow.
Okay. So this is now what I call the democratization of archaeology. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to do this on your own. Okay. You can do archaeology. Right. Anybody can do archaeology, right? You don't have to wait for some archaeologist to, do this work, which is not being done anyways. It's really, if we want to understand these sites and we want to understand these questions that we all have, we're going to have to go and do it ourselves.
It's not going to get done for us.
It's not going to get done for us.
That's
It's frustrating.
There's too little bit of these people doing this kind of work, right? And so
it's not lack of resources.
no, I mean, I did this in like an hour or two.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that hard, but this is one of these cross-disciplinary things. This is not in the archaeologist's toolbox. The teachers aren't teaching the archaeologists that they can do this kind of stuff. This is things that, well, if you take this from this discipline, you can apply it here, and what kind of insights can you get from it? That kind of work, that kind of thinking, and that kind of innovation is just not, it's taking a long time for the archaeological community to adapt to kind of this race of technology, right?
Yeah.
Got to adapt.
mean, they're going to have to
You're going to
redo a
get
lot of
left
work.
behind, maybe. There it is.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is another LiDAR scan that I did. There's a cave in the cliff below Serpent Mound. If you go to Serpent Mound, you take the hiking trail down below the cliff. There's a cave there. And I scanned this in about a minute or two using my iPhone, and you create a 3D model. You can spin it around in all kinds of dimensions, and this is what you get. Okay, now what's interesting about this little cave, people have wondered about this thing. It's not very deep, maybe about 12 feet deep. It kind of looks really circular, almost as if somebody tried to dig into the mound.
It's been worked.
Right? Or dig into the cliff. It's been worked. Well, you'll notice that there's a fissure that runs right through the center of it. Now, in many Native American cultures, particularly in the Southwest, they have oral traditions of the people emerging out of the rock.
The
They
ant
came
people,
out of
the Zuni,
well,
the
that's but
Hopi.
they also have traditions of people, women going to caves that have these kinds of fissures because they call them birthing caves.
To give birth.
And it could be that this is some kind of birthing cave, or it could be from another one of these traditions of, that people emerged from the fissure. We don't really know. But this is another one of these things that, is this related to the archaeology there? Perhaps. Has anybody studied it? No, of course
Not
they haven't. Right?
That's so wild.
Okay, so, and here's the thing about the bottom of the cliff. I pointed this out many years ago in one of these management plan meetings. If you really want to understand the time scale of Serpent Mound, we have the time capsule at the bottom of the cliff. There has been incessant erosion taking place from the dawn of time. And the cliffs are eroding and eroding and eroding. And if you go to Serpent Mound, at the bottom of the cliff, there's this giant tailing erosion pile at the base of the cliff. Okay? If you really want to understand the time scale of Serpent Mound, dig a trench in that tailings pile all the way to the base of the cliff and get your time scale, because it's all right there.
Right.
Right? If you really want to understand what's going on there, that's how you begin to build the base of knowledge. I remember watching an online presentation from a professor, one of the, I think, University of Arizona, at Harvard. She was invited to go and give this lecture at Harvard. She was doing archaeological work down in the Yucatan Peninsula.
Okay.
And she was saying, after all these years of archaeology down there, they didn't have real good sequence of carbon dating for the timeline of those areas. And so they did a specific dig just to determine what the sequence of timing was. So they went to several different sites and they did this dig. And it was like a giant inverted pyramid. They dug down more than 30 meters until they hit base rock, and they got a full sequence of carbon dates for several different sites in the Yucatan Peninsula so they could begin to understand what the true timeline was. Absolutely nothing like that has ever been done in Ohio. Not at Serpent Mound, not at any other site. There is nothing like what they're doing.
Mexico is very like they have come leaps and bounds ahead.
That's right.
They've got a lot of very open-minded archaeologists.
And so, you go to Europe, the Germans are
perplexing.
using all the sophisticated, magnetometer technology, and they're doing, Graham showed that they're doing all the sophisticated stuff, even in Indonesia.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
you know,
Padang.
and people are doing stuff in Mexico, and there's, and in Ohio,
Chilola.
zero,
Zip.
nothing. It's like a black hole of
That's
knowledge.
weird.
And we've got some of the most advanced sites in North America.
Yeah.
Right here in our own backyard.
What I mean, it's strange as I've gotten
It's
older
a
of thinking
treasure
that
trove
the
of
way I
here's-
used to
here's
view
the-
America.
Here's what
and
the
now,
situation is.
as far as
okay?
history.
Archaeology in the United States has shifted in the past, let's say from 1970 to now. For most of the 20th century up until about 1970, most of the archaeology was being done through university programs.
Right.
And, they were getting grants from the government to do this kind of work. But in the 1970s, that all changed. With the rise of private corporate archaeology, they call that cultural resource management. So
Okay.
cultural resource management companies began to be set up and that get contracts by the government to, like when the Department of Transportation builds a freeway, then they hire a cultural resource management company to come in and do that work. Or a developer of a place will hire a cultural resource
Right.
management firm to come in and they'll do that. But the thing about that is that those reports, if they're not done for the federal government, are all given to private entities, and that disappears into a black hole. It's not available for the public unless you're a professional archaeologist, card-carrying archaeologist, and they're not really telling the public about any of this stuff. There's mountains and mountains and mountains of reports that have been done in CRM archaeology that the public knows nothing about. And it's an ongoing issue. And over time, more of the archaeological work is being done by CRM companies and less done by university university programs, to the point where now in Ohio, I think we're down to just 2 archaeology programs at universities. Most of the universities have gotten rid of their archaeology programs.
Whoa.
Indiana University, which partnered with Romaine on doing work at Serpent Mound, they just announced this summer that their archaeology program is gone. No,
Whoa.
completely gone. They had one of the premier archaeological programs in the Midwest, the Glenn A. Black Lab, that has been around since the 1930s. Gone, done. No more archaeology at Indiana University. So what is happening is
I don't understand.
publicly accessible archaeology is dramatically shrinking and going in the hands of private corporate
Corporations.
archaeology. Okay? So it's the same thing I said.
It's being contracted out.
Contract, Ohio History Connection contracts with a private CRM firm to do a magnetometer survey of Serpent Mound. It goes into their private archives, not accessible to the public.
So nobody's sharing anymore.
Well, unless you're in the club.
Right.
Right.
You got to be.
Get your professional archaeological degree and certificate, then you might get permission to look at it.
Well, and if you toe the line.
Yeah.
So if you're in the Midwest, being an archaeology student, if you want to work
Pretty
in
much non-existent.
the area that you grew up in your own backyard, there's not a lot of opportunities for you right now.
Now I know there's one guy right now that interned as a high school student at National Park Service, Hopewell Culture Park, and he has gone on to the University of Michigan. He's working on getting his PhD right now, and he's doing it around Hopewell archaeology. He might be the only guy in this generation that produces an archaeologist that wants to work on Hopewell stuff,
Wow.
because
That'd be
nobody
cool.
else is doing it.
That'd be cool.
I don't think there's a single archaeological program in Ohio that is focused on doing Hopewell archaeology.
What about OSU?
OSU, I think Dr. Rob Cook, his specialty is on Fort Ancient. He doesn't really do Hopewell stuff. So he's the last guy, sort of standing. Down at University of Cincinnati, they are doing a little bit here and there, but not very much.
Sad to hear. That's very disheartening.
So you have the National Park Service, who has government hired archaeologists that are doing work, and then maybe a little bit here or there, and CRM firms. That's it.
So the public's not going to find out anything going forward?
Well, every so often,
What's the
every
sea
20
change
years
on
or so, they have a Hopewell conference that, these people get together and they share some of this stuff. There was a Hopewell conference about 3 or 4 years ago that I attended, and they put out 2 books of edited stuff from that. But yeah, comes every generation or so.
Yeah, that's so wild.
So
That's
it's like
sad.
not a continuity of information stream. It's very much like conference every 5 years.
Yeah, it
It's
doesn't.
a lot of time in between.
And that, I mean,
people
they're
connecting.
holding more regular conferences, not specific to Hopewell, but general, American archaeology conferences. And you might find a Hopewell paper here and there, but most of that stuff is in, journals that if you want to access that stuff online, if you're a private researcher, it'll cost you $58 to download an article. Because
Nope.
there's like a monopoly on scientific, publication. There's only just a couple of scientific, companies that
yeah.
publish that stuff. And, that's why there was that, site in Russia that went up where somebody at a university downloaded, several 100,000 scientific papers and put them up in Russia because they don't have an information blockade. And over here it's all copyright. They'll sue you if you, put any of that stuff up online digitally. Right.
Right.
And so there's sort of like an information blockade. If you're not in the club, you don't get access to it. If you're not in the club, it costs you too much money to access, so you never get the information.
Right. Either way, you're blocked if you're not in
Right.
it. Yeah. That's interesting.
So, yeah, that's just the state of what we deal with,
Well, I'm hoping we can raise some awareness and get people that even, for myself, I didn't know about a lot of this stuff till like 2013. I knew about Serpent Mound.
Yeah.
I knew about some burial mounds, Shrum Mound in Columbus that I visited going back to probably like 2008. But, I thought these were kind of these separate oddities that you found.
Weren't
I had
interconnected.
no clue
Yeah.
until really like 2013 of how massive and how many structures there were. So for me, that's into this stuff. By that point, I had been to Chaco Canyon. I had been to Chichen Itza. I had been to Tulum.
You go
I
to
had
those
been
places,
to,
and they have books. They have
Oh,
all
man.
kinds of material, educational for the public,
But it's
little
like-
guidebooks and stuff.
we grew up with school. We
There's none
didn't
of
take
that
a
here.
field trip to Serpent Mound. We didn't take a field trip to Newark. We didn't learn anything about our history in school
you mentioned,
at all.
You mentioned Shrum Mound here in Columbus.
Yeah.
That's owned by the Ohio History Connection,
Yeah,
excavated by them.
that was another group
Results,
of women too.
see
Results.
Yeah.
You got to go back into, their journal from about, 70, 80 years ago to find anything out about it.
Yeah, it's a real mystery. That's where they have the little Adena pipe.
I haven't been to Shrum Mound in years. Do they even have an
So they
information
cut
sign?
down all the trees.
I know they cut down all the trees,
and
but
they have just that. There's no building.
just the historic marker, right?
Yeah, and then they have that stone gate with the little
Right.
Adena pipe guy,
Yeah.
and where it has a
That
little
was all built
memorial.
like 100
That
years
was
ago.
forever ago, exactly. But
70,
now
80
it's
years
just
ago.
all surrounded by condos
Yeah.
and apartments.
And the giant quarry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, guys, we're
yeah.
approaching 4-hour episode here.
I
Wow.
don't know if there's any more slides in here. There might be one
I think
or two.
I think that might be.
Might be it.
I think that's
Okay.
it.
One
yeah.
more.
I'm clicking.
Nope,
Yep.
that might be it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we covered plenty of stuff. And
That was
and
great.
again,
And
That
there's
was
still
so
more to
you
go.
know, my work is really scratching the surface, but I'm trying my best to try to piece together what information has been out there, right? And trying to, trying to understand it as best we can.
And you're not trying to, and we aren't either. We're not trying to pick a fight with any group out there.
No.
My
Just want
whole
answers.
goal is I want to understand your perspective, Graham's perspective, OHC's. I really just want to know. I genuinely am not up here trying to, harm anyone or talk bad about anyone.
Exactly.
Or I just want to know. And the
That's right.
fact that this is in our backyard and it's so almost impossible to really get a clear-cut information. And I've looked into this stuff clearly, not in the way that Jeff has, but I've done a bit of research, and it is really hard to find information.
Yeah.
And that's something we're hoping to change, that hopefully we can contribute to. And I'll have anybody on this show to chat, and I think it'd be incredible to have a giant Ohio archaeology debate. That
Good luck with that.
we would
Town hall.
love to host
It'll end
that.
up being something like Hancock. He's challenging these
Zahi
criticisms of him from the archaeological community, and no one will debate him on Joe Rogan's show. So
They
Yep.
won't do it.
they won't do it.
Yeah.
Well, it's probably a reason why. If you can't, refute the work, then again, like I said earlier, you criticize from some other
Yeah.
angle. You
Right.
Yep.
turn the fight a different way. But yeah,
But yeah, again, I'm not an archaeologist.
right.
I'm just a guy that has questions about the origins of these things. When I go and see these things, I have questions, and I just want them answered.
Right.
Yeah.
So I take it upon myself to try to find those answers.
Yeah.
And I encourage everybody to do that.
Yeah.
Right. Like there are so many archaeological sites, prehistoric in the United States, that still exist, and virtually nothing is being written about them, scratching the surface. Lots more studies. People want to go out there, find the answers on your own, do the digging, just like I did,
Yeah.
It can be done.
Yeah.
It can be done.
Yeah.
Well, this has been incredible.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Bub, but
I'm
what
good.
an episode. We've had an incredible week.
Yeah.
We've had
having a great
Cryptids
time.
of the Corn in
You've
studio.
been on,
We got
you've been on my
Jeff.
tour before,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Of Serpent Mound. What I always tell everybody at the end of that is, you now know more than 99% of everybody else.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So
and
My
in a
brain is
sitting
full
and just,
of information
yeah,
right now.
we can't go any longer. But yeah,
Oh, man.
I want to read the book when it comes out.
yeah, so that'll
I
be
can't wait for
I
that'll
wanna
be
get into
next
that
year.
series.
But my Ancient Monuments Expanded Edition will be out before that. So.
Yes.
That too. I want that as well.
So that
I'm gonna have to
brings.
get both of
Hey,
those.
where can we find you?
Yeah.
Well,
So-
what do you got some stuff coming up?
You can get a hold of me through serpentmound.org. That's the Friends of Serpent Mound's webpage.
Okay.
We have a Facebook page. You can go to Friends of Serpent Mound on Facebook and get a hold of me through there.
Okay.
Again, you mentioned I have a talk tomorrow, but I do also have a lecture upcoming at the Pickaway County Historical Society in mid-January. Check them out for details. It'll be a talk about the ancient monument stuff specific to Circleville, and they asked me to talk about the Alligator Mound. For some reason,
Granville.
in Granville.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to talk about the material that I found in there, and I'm going to tell everybody how the Alligator Mound really got its name.
Okay.
Because for the last 25 years, the Ohio Historical Society has been telling everybody a completely fabricated story. And so the documents I found, in my work for this book tell you what the real story is. And
Oh,
so,
cool. That'll be cool.
Be looking out for that.
Where in the books? Just Amazon online. To
Actually,
find?
Where will it be available?
you can get it print on demand through lulu.com.
Lulu.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Awesome.
Definitely will.
Yeah.
So Jeff has a talk. If you guys are in the Adams County area tomorrow,
Yep.
at Serpent Mound Star Knowledge Conference, the winter solstice event, you
Yeah.
can see him live at 11 a.m. tomorrow.
Yeah.
You better get going, man. You got to get some sleep, dude.
2 hours back home, right?
Thank you very much.
Again, we
Yeah.
are The Strange Road. I'm Mikey. This is Bub. You can find us on all social media platforms at The Strange Road. Hit us up on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. We're on Twitter at The Strange Road. Bub is,
At Bub Ranley.
and I'm at Spiral Mikey on Instagram. If you guys want to hit me up with the DM. You can probably get a hold of me a little better on our Strange Road Instagram page. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear what you thought about the episode today and all of Jeff's
definitely.
information. And
Thanks
we
for
wanna,
having me, guys. I
Yeah,
appreciate
man.
100%. Yeah. Anytime.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, Jeff. And as always, every time I hang out with you, my head just feels like it's literally going to come apart at the seams, just filled with information. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or anything at all?
Everybody have a happy holiday.
Yeah.
Very good.
We're approaching the winter solstice and Christmas. So
Yep.
everybody out there, happy holidays from
Winter solstice next week.
Yep.
Yes.
Happy holidays, everyone.
We're getting close to the winter solstice. So everybody take care. Much love. This will be available probably next week on all the audio platforms, Spotify, Google, Apple. We're on Amazon Music. We're on Stitcher now. We're wherever you listen to your podcasts. Adios. Thank you so much.
See you guys.